Chapter 1001 Undefeatable. Northern glared at the creature, refusing to believe the monster had actually obliterated the academy, for the most part, from the surface of the island. He had somehow managed to save countless people, but many more remained injured. He didn't even know where Aster was and had been using his spatial awareness to actively search around, but still hadn't found him. And yet, the evil dragon still floated in the sky, looking down upon them all, ready to unleash another devastating attack at any moment. Well, technically, it couldn't or most likely wouldn't be able to, if everything went according to Northern's assumption. But if it happened that the Leviathan could easily shrug off the effect of his absolute lock, then Northern and everyone here was finished. However, he was trusting himself and no other person to protect the survivors. Because as it turned out, even the students who had been stubborn about coming to save their home had proven utterly useless. But that was all right because even the instructors were useless too. Northern slowly ascended into the sky and came face to face with the evil dragon. The dragon snarled, crimson smoke pouring from its mouth. Then suddenly, the sky trembled and the massive monster lunged forward with blistering speed. But Northern was waiting for it. He materialized a spear of ice and coiled fire around it. Then he smothered the fire with the shadows of dread, wielded the spear in an instant, and shot forward too, colliding with the monster midair. The air rippled and shockwaves exploded outward, destroying everything even further. Northern drove the spear between the monster's gaping maws that wanted to snatch him and make a snack out of him with no effort. The monster's maw was caught open for a brief moment. However, the spear snapped and came crashing down. Before that happened, though, Northern had already fired 3 more into the enlarged mouth. He controlled the frozen spears from within and began to use absolute zero. However, the monster suddenly began to boil, smoke billowing from its skin, its scales reddening even more and eyes blazing. Then Northern began to feel the effect of his skill being reversed. However, he did not stop there. Taking advantage of the little ice that was being destabilized in the body of the Leviathan, Northern used a combination that he devised on the whim. It was simply the complete opposite of absolute zero. The destabilization was breaking down the freezing molecules of his ice components, the ones that continuously spread. There was a fragment of law each of those molecules carried, and when that fragment emerged as law, that was what enforced the rule of absolute zero: all things freeze, even movement. However, if he did the complete opposite, delicately using the advantage of the law and the heat of Sun's legacy, he could flip the rules and make them the exact opposite too. This would raise the heat to a standard that was obviously not 100, but would keep rising infinitely. This was simply the essence of the difference. In such a moment, he couldn't have thought of a better name than absolute heat. The words left his lips not in a shout, but in a whisper. Yet they thundered through reality like a divine proclamation. The Leviathan shrieked as the law embedded in the ice fragments inverted. The frozen particles inside its mouth, throat, and chest did not melt. They ignited. But this was not flame as the world knew it. This was heat that was not born from combustion, but from conceptual ignition. The very laws that govern temperature, what could be burned, what could be endured, were being rewritten in real time. Northern's eyes blazed with radiance, twin stars of blue flames. His entire body was wrapped in a chaotic halo, embers dancing with frost, light bending from the sheer contrast of concepts battling to coexist. The Leviathan convulsed midair. Its entire form bulged unnaturally, as if something was expanding from within. Its own thermal regulation, honed over countless millennia, began to fail. Its inner core, what once fueled its corruption, reacted violently, surging against the ancient bindings that kept its monstrous biology intact. And yet, Northern wasn't done. He moved like a streak of lightning across the Leviathan's massive form, embedding more spears into the beast, not for damage but as anchors. With each one, he wove more of the unstable conceptual law of absolute heat into the monster's very blood. Northern grinned wickedly, savoring the Leviathan's tormented reaction with glory and splendor. Since the beginning of the battle, this seemed to be the first real damage the bastard was receiving. Northern's grin stretched even wider. Yes, dance for me. He raised his hands to the sky, and hundreds of ice spears materialized, blanketing the air. All of them plunged into the beast, anchoring absolute heat within. The evil dragon continued to convulse, and the convulsions dragged on. It wasn't difficult to tell that its cells were being torn apart at an alarming rate. Northern paused, his smile slowly dying as he watched the Leviathan. Indeed, everything that comprised its existence was under intense heat that never stopped rising. Hence, there was a sequence of movement too fast for the monster's body and mind to process. However, the monster should already be dying by now. A dark frown creased Northern's brow. He watched the creature with keen eyes, staring for a few seconds. Then he saw it. Immediately, he gritted his teeth. This bastard! As fast as the rules of absolute heat tormented the evil dragon, it was rewriting the laws of its soul, body, and mind with the same speed and effectiveness. It was a loop of destruction. It felt like restoration flowed with destruction in an endless cycle, with the same speed and same power. Everything was chaotic, and that chaos raging inside the monster felt just right. At that point, Northern's eyes trembled and widened. He moved, but suddenly the world shifted, causing him to halt. He frowned, terror etched in stark lines across his face. Northern didn't know what more could go wrong at this point. Absolute lock, while it might have sealed the monster's abilities, was completely useless against the sheer potency of its will. And now, it seemed like the damned creature was about to unleash something truly malevolent into the world. Northern began to perspire. Chapter 1002. Sun Legacy Part 1. Northern was flooded with bewildering thoughts and froze for a millisecond as day suddenly plunged into crimson night. He levitated there, paralyzed and drenched in sweat. For a moment, dread crashed over his senses and body, as if no matter what he did, the monster would never die. A Leviathan was simply too powerful to be defeated, even by someone like him. Perhaps retreating to chaos and void was his only option. Without chaos and void, he was nothing. However, after that millisecond of doubt, Northern snapped upright with fierce resolve. He might be a coward in several areas, but he had never proven to be mentally fragile. His mental fortitude was unbreakable. Since being born in Trail, the first time, of course, this was the first instance he'd felt it waver with such intensity, and even that hadn't lasted a full second. Northern covered his face with his palm, grinning behind it. Well, damn. Leviathans are definitely not your average monsters. Northern lifted his face to the sky with a grimace as crimson darkness smothered everything. There was a sudden drop in gravity, then everything plunged into pitch blackness for a moment. Northern felt something in the atmosphere he could only describe as an inversion, like the world had been flipped inside out. When the darkness dissolved, giving way to the crimson veil, the world he saw bore no resemblance to what had existed just a millisecond before. Something was catastrophically wrong. First, there was no land beneath him. Instead, an ocean of flowing crimson smoke churned and rolled like an ominous sea of primal evil, waiting to devour everything. Mountains jutted from the crimson ocean like arrowheads dipped and drenched in blood. The tide flowed endlessly to the realm's edge. The mountains themselves seemed to be the source of whatever catastrophe this realm harbored. But there was no way to tell for certain. Northern exhaled and fixed the monster with a death glare. Oh well, to be dragged into a monster's soul world. What an honor. This was his first time witnessing a soul world live and direct. But it wasn't so different from Burning Storm's. In fact, Burning Storm's soul world had seemed far stronger. This one felt bland, hollow, and dying. Being inside it confirmed something Northern had suspected all along. He touched his chest with a soft frown, then surveyed the entire realm with a calm expression. Really? Chaos? The entire realm suddenly bellowed and roared. Northern snapped out of his thoughts and fixed his attention on the Leviathan. Good. Perhaps I can learn from you how to handle a soul world. Northern slowly exhaled, and steam began leaking from his body. Solar ascension. The heat blazed and formed a second skin around his body. His skin began cracking as molten veins of volcanic fire streaked across his surface. His hair slowly rose, the white color shifting as it radiated power. His eyes blazed with flames and ignited with radiance that seemed to consume his humanity. The molten veins spread across his body, even onto his face. Then his hair flowed upward and began to dance, slowly transforming into fire. His hair became a complete altar of flames that danced subtly. His eyes burned. His skin darkened and hardened with searing heat, and golden metallic liquid flowed over his arms before solidifying. His armor was destroyed by these transformations, but Northern didn't need to worry about that. This was what Sun Legacy truly was, Northern's strongest talent, perhaps second only to one true self. Northern locked eyes with the evil dragon. I've been hesitant about using this because of the environment. It's incredibly powerful, and I don't want people caught as collateral damage. But dragging me into your soul world was the perfect move. He raised his chin and smirked. Show me just how strong you are. Northern surged forward, but the distance between him and the Leviathan suddenly stretched infinitely. His feet blazed with comet trails of flame, exploding him forward with even more force, yet he couldn't seem to close the gap. Instead, something bizarre happened. The world suddenly inverted, and with lightning speed that Northern couldn't react to, a mountain slammed into him. As he plummeted, he was falling toward the crimson ocean of mist below. The jagged peak crushed into him with devastating force. Northern managed to use the heat waves around his burning body to create a shield in the final second before impact, preventing the mountain from pulverizing his body on contact, but he couldn't counter the overwhelming force of an entire mountain. He was hurled groundward at alarming speed, powerless to resist the momentum. Northern grabbed the side of the jagged peak, like an ant clutching the roof edge of a falling building. It was a spectacle to behold. However, that ant suddenly blazed with a torrent of fire that surged backward with explosive force, creating a mountain of flames that mirrored the stone mountain driving him earthward. The opposing forces entered a stalemate for a moment, and Northern gained enough power to counter the mountain's momentum. Moreover, a flood of ice lances, not hundreds, not thousands, but an absolute deluge, materialized in the air and began flying into the mountain, crushing against it as ice spread across its surface. But the mountain wouldn't break. It blazed with molten heat that instantly evaporated the ice, turning it to scalding steam. It flared with even greater force, fighting against Northern's resistance. The evil dragon swooped down and landed on the mountain's slanted surface, adding even more weight and power to the crushing force. Northern was driven back 10 meters before his own mountain of flames blazed more powerfully. The fire radiated in all directions, burning with ferocious intensity and crashing into the ground, forcing the ocean of crimson clouds to retreat and flee from the impact zone. From all around them, thousands of fire comets ignited and began streaking toward the mountain. Within moments they collided, and a thunderous explosion consumed the enormous peak, shattering it further. Northern groaned as he crushed the sides he was gripping. Ashen eternity. Instantly, his hands radiated power, and the mountain began to crumble, decompose, and dissolve into ash beneath his grasp. The Leviathan launched itself from the mountain, wings beating powerfully against the air currents. It hovered and seemed to bore a fierce stare into Northern, whose hair blazed as he dusted the ashes from his body. Northern finished and fixed the monster with a glare of his own. What? You thought you were the only one with trump cards. Chapter 1003, Sun Legacy, Part 2. After the entire mountain crumbled to ash, the vast airspace of the Leviathan's soul world was drowned in gray clouds that seemed to linger endlessly. Northern had risen above it. The evil dragon had as well. Now, both glared at each other in silence. The altar of flames that danced above Northern's head darkened and slowly shifted to a purple-dark flame. The rest of his body also became somewhat dark. Northern extended the liquid gold that curled around his body, commanding it to emerge and form a great spear in his hands. As he grasped the spear, smoke billowed from his palm as it was seared by the immense heat of the golden weapon. Instead of caring for the pain, Northern fixed the evil dragon with an intense stare. Then the shadows around him veiled the sky, at least a large portion of it. The sky was too vast and tyrannical to be covered by a mere talent such as Northern's. However, eclipsing dread was not a mere talent. It was a source of dread and the only abstract weapon that Northern could wield against the will of the Leviathan. Perhaps not the only one, but Oblivion's mark served more as a shield than a weapon. Northern had constantly been using its nullify effect to dampen the will of the Leviathan, which was what even made it possible to assume Solar Ascension form in the first place and use some of his talent abilities. Because he was perpetually feeling a heavy tension weighing on his soul, negating the existence of his talents, as if they should not be. He had easily guessed that the evil dragon was most likely writing a law that refused Northern's existence in its soul world. But Northern was resisting the law tooth and nail. Having to fight the battle in the Leviathan's soul was not faring well for him. But if he wanted to win this war without making an entire island vanish from the surface of the map, this was his best shot. The dread that permeated from the shadows weakened the enemy's mind. While that effect might seem insignificant to a mindless monster, its will, however, could be considered a mind of sorts. And just as Northern thought, the moment the shadow veiled a segment of the clouds, a crushing weight descended upon the atmosphere. He almost wanted to drop to his knees, but he could resist the force enough to remain levitating in the air. The clashing of dread against the monster's will was like the collision of two incredibly powerful wills. Void essence fueled Northern's eclipsing dread, which gave it a delusion of power. However, the monster's will was the real deal. He could not afford to waste any more time. Northern flew forward like a missile and collided once again with the monster. The evil dragon was sent hurtling through the air the moment the impact resounded. Northern threw the golden spear up and caught it in reverse grip. Like a trained javelin thrower, he tilted his body and hurled the spear into the air. A shockwave exploded outward as the spear left his hand and tore through the air. Barely a second later, it pierced into the wing of the Leviathan with savage speed. Then Northern began to drop wind tornadoes on the landscape. The wind tornadoes were of different kinds. They originated from the shadows above him, drinking a portion of the dread and using it to negate the very forces of the Leviathan's will that existed within the air of its soul world. As each tornado touched the ocean of crimson clouds, wind blades were sent out of the whirling winds, crashing against distant mountains. Even the ocean itself was being embedded with wind blades. And more tornadoes fell from the shadows above. Some mixed with darkness, others with fire, others with ice. They were all of different varieties, and in less than a second they populated the entire soul world and were striking down the very components of the soul that made up the will, the world, and the existence of the monster. To make matters worse, the Leviathan had suffered great damage and could not manage to fly. It had crashed down against one of its mountains, and Northern had flown away in pursuit. He retrieved the spear. Its great length was 5 times Northern's height, but he wielded it with ease, falling with tremendous speed and hurling the spear straight into the monster. The entire landscape shook as the strike connected. Felt like it belched thunder. But Northern did not care. He rose high into the sky like a supersonic rocket and fell like a meteor. He rose again and fell. He rose with even greater speed and fell down, causing the place to send a violent circle of shockwaves rolling outward. As the evil dragon was being brutalized, so was its soul world. Held back by the eclipsing dread, diluted by nullify, the strength of the will of the Leviathan's soul world to resist the attacks on its soul, or at least rewrite the rules, was too feeble. Moreover, the monster was focusing a chunk of that will to survive Northern's mountain-shattering falls. The monster was dying faster than it could rewrite the rules of its own body. And to make things worse, the reality of its soul world was beginning to crack. The tornadoes grew more violent and continued to assault the soul world. The walls of its reality were being violated by invisible blades that flew like gales of wind. The crimson ocean of clouds had parted in several segments, scattered unevenly across the ground. The tornadoes crashed into them and consumed them. Fire ignited in the depths of the tornado and spread the moment it crashed with the crimson cloud. The fire was that of Sun Legacy. It was not ordinary fire. It was that of the sun, and its burning power was in no way mundane. It melted the very clouds with devastating speed, causing the crimson clouds to become sentient and even flee for their lives. The wind blades did not stop flying out, and Northern did not stop striking the Leviathan. The monster at some point grew feral. It let out a deafening cry that threatened to shatter one's soul, but Northern, floating above with a dark glare, was unmoved. The Leviathan tried to stand, scrambling up with a tattered body amidst a shattered and crumbled mountain. But Northern was preparing another attack. He released the spear from his grasp, letting the golden liquid flow and form a large circle. Then he summoned the sun. Chapter 1004, New Soul. The golden circle expanded, its molten edges rippling like liquid fire as Northern channeled the full might of his solar ascension. The altar of purple-dark flames atop his head suddenly erupted, soaring to form a colossal halo that blazed with renewed intensity, casting an ominous glow across the devastated soul world. The summoned sun materialized slowly at first, a pinprick of brilliant light within the golden circle. But as Northern poured more essence into it, the miniature star swelled, its surface churning with solar storms that defied the laws of the Leviathan's reality. The heat radiating from it began to warp the very air, turning the gray ash clouds into writhing vapor. The evil dragon, despite its feral state, seemed to sense the approaching apocalypse. Its remaining eye, the other had been torn away during one of Northern's devastating strikes, fixed upon the growing sun with what might have been recognition, or perhaps terror. The creature's massive form shuddered as it attempted to channel its will into one final defensive measure. But the soul world was already too fractured. The tornadoes continued their relentless assault, each one carrying fragments of dread that devoured the foundation of the Leviathan's existence. Where fire tornadoes had passed, the landscape bore scars of melted reality, twisted valleys where the very concept of distance had been incinerated. Northern felt the familiar searing pain as his hands began to smoke from controlling such immense solar energy. The sun within the golden circle had grown to the size of a building, its gravitational pull beginning to distort the remaining mountains. Chunks of stone and crystallized soul matter were drawn inexorably toward the artificial star. "Are you ready?" Northern's voice somehow carried across the chaos despite the howling winds and crackling flames. The Leviathan made one last desperate attempt to rewrite the laws of its domain. Reality flickered around the monster as it tried to simply erase Northern from existence, to declare that he had never been, that this invasion of its sacred space was merely a nightmare. But Northern's left eye shimmered with red light. The moment he sensed it, he poured more essence into Oblivion's mark, strengthening the nullifiability so much that one clone, full of essence, was exhausted, and the creature's efforts crumbled like sand. Northern raised both hands toward the sun he had created. The golden liquid responded, forming intricate patterns in the air, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, defying perception. With a gesture that felt like tearing apart his very soul, he hurled the miniature star directly at the struggling Leviathan. The impact was more than an explosion, it was an unmaking. Where the sun struck, reality simply ceased. The evil dragon's roar cut off mid-scream as portions of its body were consumed not by fire, but by the absolute authority of solar judgment. The very concept of the monster began to unravel, starting from the point of contact and spreading outward like cracks in glass. The soul world convulsed. Mountains that had stood since the Leviathan's birth crumbled into nothing. The crimson ocean boiled away into nothingness. Even the crimson sky began to collapse inward, as if the universe itself was folding up like a discarded map. Northern watched as the creature that had threatened an entire island writhed in its final moments. The eclipsing dread above him pulsed with dark satisfaction, feeding on the terror and despair that emanated from the dying monster's essence. But Northern felt no joy in this victory, only the grim satisfaction of a necessary task completed. As the last echoes of the Leviathan's death cry faded into the collapsing emptiness, Northern began his own transition back to the physical world. The soul world was dissolving around him, taking with it all traces of the ancient evil that had lurked beneath its waves of reality. But even as victory seemed assured, Northern could feel something else stirring in the depths of the dying soul world, something that had been hidden beneath layers of the Leviathan's consciousness, something that whispered of older hungers and darker purposes. The wrong and twisted chaos he had witnessed in the monster and its soul world was difficult to shake off. Something had to be wrong, he could feel it in his gut. He just couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, and that was frustrating enough. The soul world crumbled into nothingness, and Northern found himself floating amidst the bright sky. He saw the notification display appear before his eyes. Congratulations, you have slain a catastrophic Leviathan, Chaos Dragon. You have slain the remnants of a tyrant. You have gained plus 1,000 talent fragments. Northern stood midair watching the display. He was expecting more, but there seemed to be a pause that caused him to raise his brow. That's all. Suddenly, in that moment, he felt his entire soul buckle, then tighten. Northern clenched his chest hard, groaning with labored breathing. Each attempt to breathe felt like carrying the weight of the world in his soul. Something had entered his soul. He knew it, and he could most likely guess what it was. Whatever the damn thing was, it was causing his soul to change, though Northern had no idea what sort of change this was. Your soul has absorbed a tremendous amount of corrupted chaos. His eyes widened. So that was what it was? Corrupted chaos is being purified in your soul. The pain intensified so much that Northern couldn't hold it anymore. He tried, but the agony assaulted him with 1,000 burning swords, cutting at the flesh of his soul 1,000 different times with each blade. Alas, he couldn't maintain flight, and he plummeted through the clouds, crashing into the ground and causing enormous shockwaves to roll outward through the earth, devastating everything. Other survivors could see clearly that the Leviathan was gone. They had witnessed Northern fall onto the island, far from where the academy stood. In fact, Annette, who had been a stark witness, was already racing toward his location. Several others followed, their minds shattered yet filled with mixed awe and intense joy that the abomination was indeed eradicated. Northern, meanwhile, curled on the ground in the middle of the crater his fall had created, groaning painfully and clawing at the soil as his soul continued to tear through the walls of its limitation, forcing out a fundamental change. The transformation surging through Northern was violent. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it was happening anyway. His soul was evolving, but this wasn't the same evolution. There was something twisted, wrong about this particular evolution, something that should never have occurred. Something was growing out of his soul, and it was lethal. Seed of Void is undergoing a crude transformation. Chaos is overpowering Void. Seed of Void is slowly becoming Seed of Chaos. The seed in your soul is forcibly germinating. As the notifications continued, so did Northern's torment. He groaned hard, clutching his chest as his soul fought against him like it never belonged to him. Chapter 1005. We are all going to die. The march to Variolania was drawing to a close. What should have stretched over days they'd managed to complete in under one. And it was all thanks to the remarkable colleagues who happened to be journeying with him. First was the young woman. Although she rarely spoke, her skill with the spear was flawless. Her speed was terrifying, and the way she brutalized her foes was haunting. Despite being an ascendant, Zion did not think he would want to make an enemy of her. Then there was the guy, that one was even more vicious. Both of them rarely used their talents, the lady especially. He had never seen her use hers even once, unless it was something subtle like a mental attack kind of talent. Now that he thought about it, she usually did seem a bit crazed whenever she was drenched in the flow of battle. Ascendant Zion shook his head. What am I thinking about right now? Those were the foremost people he'd thank. Their strength was invaluable beyond the battlefield. But the most important reason why their battles were considerably easier: the summons. At first, he started with just 3. The strange-looking beast with horns, the knight whose face was completely covered by his helmet. Zion had even wondered how he could see through it, and the 4-armed monster that was following them. Granted, It behaved more human than any monster Ascendant Zion had ever encountered. Hence, referring to it as a monster felt strange. As the intensity of the battles escalated, more of them came. A black-skinned, lithe warrior whose presence dripped with ineffable grace. More were added from the enigmatic sage Rian's summons, and things progressed even more smoothly than before. And although there were several mishaps here and there, most of them were internal conflicts between them rather than monsters, especially between Linus and Braham. The former had almost killed the latter, if Jeskai and he had not intervened just in time. From that moment, things had been somewhat tense between them. Now they were preparing to face the final horde of monsters, and the monster they were preparing to face was incredibly strong and difficult to kill. But scouts had been sent forward and information had been gathered. Moreover, there was a group of drifters who claimed they had faced the monster before alongside Sage Rian. Apparently the monster had fled from Sage Rian's grasp. Things weren't looking promising for them, but Zion was not discouraged. He believed he could truly vanquish the shadow monster with the over 100 drifters accompanying him, and some incredibly powerful creatures. Ascendant Zion sighed, sitting on a log they had felled the night before while building their temporary camp. He looked around. The forest scenery was bustling. Countless trees had been hewn down, most with drifters' abilities rather than tools. The efficiency and speed required to achieve the task was staggering. They had managed to create several makeshift shelters. While not as sturdy as a war camp would be, they passed well enough for mundane purposes. Far away, in the center of the camp, a massive bonfire burned where they had cooked food for the entire camp and served as a watchtower of sorts through the night. There was a drifter who could use smoke to detect movement. The constant burning filled the entire forest with smoke and sharpened his senses. It was also a strategy to muddle the monster's perception. A lot of drifters were gathered in one place. The scent of their souls would undoubtedly be more intense than ever. But the smoke was bound to throw the monsters off at least a bit. It wasn't effective in the long run, and they never needed it to be. They just needed to survive one night, and they had. Now they were preparing to continue their journey. The bonfire had been extinguished, but its smoke still rolled into the sky. Drifters moved around, clearing the area. Some smashed the wood into bits, erasing their scents with the blood of abominations they'd recently hunted. Others sat conversing lazily, as if they weren't about to fight a shadow storm. Ascendant Zion couldn't really blame them. Many had grown complacent because of the creatures that were their allies. However, he knew this was not the time for complacency. He frowned and stood up sharply, clenching his fist. The moment he stood, Abyss Tyrant stirred, leaning away from the tree. Silence fell over the camp. Some people were still moving, carrying wood, pouring blood on the ground, but they all went silent, turning toward Ascendant Zion and the Abyss Tyrant standing behind him. Having their attention effortlessly, Zion spoke. "This is not the time to drag around. There is an urgent need for us to." He suddenly went deathly pale, his eyes widening with terror. Something strange was happening across the sky. It was a perfect day, mid-morning, but suddenly the clouds darkened. Everyone raised their eyes to the sky, mumbling with confusion. But that wasn't even the crux of the disaster about to befall them. Ascendant Zion was quite used to Abyss Tyrant's presence. That one hung around him constantly, so over the past day, he had grown accustomed to it. Which was why he could tell when it suddenly vanished. His eyes widened and he swung around. Behind him, their powerful monster ally was gone. Not just him. The young man in the silver helm and white flowing cloak was gone too. The strange short beast with horns was gone. The black, lithe monster with dark grace was also gone. His eyes widened with terror, hands trembling as fear crept into his heart. The darkening day made processing what was happening even harder. All around them, a mist of shadows was consuming everything, slowly creeping closer. Jeskai suddenly lunged forward and slapped his face. His head snapped to the side as he staggered. Finally, he was back to his senses, his eyes wide. Linus manifested his glass-like wings and looked at him with a condescending glare. Pathetic. Jeskai frowned at him as well. Get your head straight. You have a battle to win. Ascendant Zion's widened eyes trembled. Did they not realize it? But they're gone. Jeskai manifested her spear and sinister shield, holding the shield to her chest as she got into stance. What difference does it make? We fought to win then, we fight to win now. Ascendant Zion was breaking apart inside his mind. What difference does it make? What difference does it make? It makes all the difference in the world. We are all going to die. Chapter 1006. Ruffsburg's Return. The cave's depths were lightless, stark, absolute darkness, as if the world's light had never touched this realm since the dawn of creation. In such darkness, footsteps echoed. Each step held patient rhythm, its echo revealing how gently it kissed the ground before lifting away. The footsteps continued as the figure, shrouded in darkness, pressed forward. The shadows seemed to follow him, though that was merely illusion. After a while, the mysterious figure climbed spiraling stairs that appeared grown from the cavern wall itself. He followed this path for several minutes until he reached the cave's upper level. Upon reaching the upper level, he felt subtle tremors. That such vibrations could penetrate this deep, no matter how faint, told him that whatever raged on the surface operated at a scale that could devour mountains. Yet the tremors neither stopped him nor affected his pace or bearing. They were insignificant to him. Finally, he reached a section of the cave bathed in blue light from insects dancing through the upper cavern air. Their glow was ghostly, yet it cast enough luminance across the man's face. Strong features emerged, a powerfully carved jaw, eyes both gentle and profound. His ashen hair flowed long, as though he dwelt here for centuries. His body resembled sculpture more than flesh. No human could possess such refined, sharp, and commanding muscle definition. Only ancient star beings, lost to time's tears, could have carved such perfection into stone. His torso was bare, while loose pants hung from his lower body, threatening to slip and reveal his waistline both front and back. The man's eyes held countless mysteries simultaneously, yet appeared completely normal, casual. A soft gray glow kindled in his eyes as he gazed forward. One corner of his mouth curved upward. "Humph! You came all this way to welcome me." Someone sat on the stairs leading to the upper ground level. Khal, having shifted to his usual form with long black hair, clicked his tongue in irritation. "Tsk, I'd be damned." He paused, studying the figure before him, who appeared to be in his early 30s. "Barely 2 years ago you were a child. How are you so aged now?" The man rolled his eyes. 10 years ago I was a dying old man. What can I say? The world revolves around me?" He chuckled and waved dismissively at Khal. "Oh, save it. I'm certain you didn't come all this way to compliment my good looks." Khal slowly rose and faced the man, lifting his chin. "It's refreshing to know that at least one element of my plan went smoothly. Welcome back, humanity's strongest drifter." Ruffsburg. Ruffsburg gripped his neck and cracked it left and right, producing a sickening bone-breaking sound. Then he smiled and regarded Khal. "First, bring me up to speed." Khal fixed him with a dark glare. "Your academy has been erased from the map." Ruffsburg smiled. "I sensed as much from the depths. It's just buildings, we can always construct another. Tell me something more significant." Khal chuckled dryly, his expression humorless. "If the Academy's destruction isn't newsworthy enough, then nothing could be." "But—" Khal lingered, drawing Ruffsburg's intense stare. "I need you to suppress someone for me." Khal gritted his teeth internally. "He's been a complete foil to my plans." Ruffsburg folded his arms, his smile emotionless. "Let me guess. The boy on behalf of whom you called me suddenly some time ago told me he just met me and asked me to send him into a rift in Stelia?" Khal nodded, exasperated. "I figured he was special when you made such an unusual call since you never reach out first. He must be more exceptional than I thought if he's frustrating your plans this severely." Khal shook his head. "You have no idea." He paused and added, "Just handle him, and don't kill him. I need him alive." Ruffsburg stepped closer, speaking casually. "First, Khal, I don't take orders from you. Normal humans, when requesting favors, say, "Can you please? I understand you're not normal, so I'll let you off the hook. Just this once." He stopped before Call with one finger extended. "However, I'm curious about this boy, so I'll investigate him myself." With that statement, Ruffsberg continued his measured steps forward, passing Call and ascending to the next level. Call remained with an indifferent expression until Ruffsberg vanished completely. Then he clenched his fist and slammed it into the wall, embedding massive webbed cracks across the cavern stone. The entire cave shuddered. The seed of chaos is germinating. The germination process is altering the core fundamentals of your soul.
System XL Vava. System XL Vava. System XL Vava.
Omniform is reacting. Unwritten is reacting. Omniform is changing the form of your soul. Unwritten is rewriting the identity of your soul. Your soul form is changing. Your soul identity is changing. Seed of chaos is being rooted. Failed. 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 Unwritten and omniform is invading the seed. Chaos is being expelled. The concept of formlessness is taking root in your soul. Talents fragments are being consumed to increase success rate. Talents fragments are being consumed to increase success rate. Talents fragments are being consumed to increase success rate. Seed has been fully invaded. Seed has been transformed to seed of endless. The pain continued assaulting him from all sides, but now it was bearable. After the flood of notifications, Northern felt he could breathe again, as if the weight of 1,000 worlds had lifted from his chest. His breathing had never felt so effortless. He collapsed to the ground, panting and sweating. In that moment, Annette slid down from the crater's edge and rushed to him. "North boy, are you all right?" Vita accompanied her, running down the slope while Annette knelt beside Northern. She touched him gently. "North!" Northern exhaled heavily and slowly propped himself up. His face was pale and glistening with sweat. He opened his mouth, his voice emerging more hoarsely than ever, as if his vocal cords had been stripped raw. "Water! Here!" The voice belonged to neither Vita nor Annette. It was masculine. The speaker bent over, extending a silver bottle toward Northern. Northern raised a brow. "Ha! He looks like Ruffsberg." In that same instant, the entire air trembled. Northern's eyes blazed with fierce blue light, his soul burning with hatred potent enough to incinerate the world. Ruffsberg tilted his head with a gentle smile, masking dangerous malevolence. "What perilous hatred you harbor." He casually shifted his weight to step closer to Northern, but before that single foot lifted from the ground, he was surrounded, encircled from every angle. Abyss Tyrant aimed his staff at Ruffsberg's throat. Nebulous Lord flanked the right, elongated claws poised at eye level. Light of Featherstone pressed his blade across the neck from the left angle. Towering behind them loomed the Blood King. Even Mr. Fluffy and Corpse Eater materialized at each flank, hemming in his position. Revan's finger targeted Ruffsberg's other eye while Byran stood guard before Northern, gripping Ruffsberg's razor-sharp fingers that had shot toward Northern in a blur, a strike the rest had somehow missed detecting. Chapter 1007, Reason. In a single instant, Ruffsberg was rendered incapable of movement. Still, he was smiling. Death lurked at him from every angle his eyes could turn to. Yet his eerie, emotionless smile never wavered. His eyes even never left the point they had originally fixed upon. Northern staggered back, his eyes widening as he stared at the razor-sharp nails that Byran had intercepted. He had been caught off guard and had never even seen the attack coming, which meant that if Byran had not appeared to halt that hand, he most likely would have lost an eye to Ruffsberg. After all his boasting, all his preparations to welcome the source of his suffering, Northern was bitterly disappointed in himself. He had an excuse but refused to take it at all. Ruffsberg's return had nearly claimed his eyes right away. He gritted his teeth internally, glaring at the man standing before him with that ominous smile. Ruffsberg looked so different from 2 years ago. It was, in fact, utterly impossible for him to have grown this much. But Northern had long since abandoned normal reasoning since hearing that the young child had once been the principal of the academy too. So as startling as the new appearance was, it wasn't so surprising. Annette was overwhelmed and confused. One moment, she was trying to console Northern. The next, a man was there. Barely a second had passed before the entire place was swarming with monstrous existences. Entities that made her bones feel ice-cold in her body. The atmosphere was charged with such terror that she felt like she was shrinking. Not to mention the man they surrounded. Why did he suddenly feel like the most dangerous of them all? Annette came from a renowned family. Before being banished, she had walked alongside many strong people on familiar terms, especially as a child. Even throughout her experience as a drifter, she had encountered countless powerful individuals. A few times she had even crossed paths with 2 of the princes of Riemgard. And yet, never had anyone's presence threatened to crush her into a bloody pulp. Something was terribly wrong, and she could feel it deep within her soul. Vita behind her was trembling, her legs frozen despite wanting to retreat, afraid that she might make even the slightest sound in the desolate silence. Eventually, the cornered man tilted his head slightly, surveying all that surrounded him. Intriguing. Void and chaos. You accomplished this much with it. I don't think even the Chaos Prince came this far. Northern's brows furrowed. He knows about the Chaos Prince? Of course he knew about the Chaos Prince. If he could discover it, then many other drifters probably had as well. And Ruffsberg would undoubtedly know more than the top 10% of drifters did. Don't look so bewildered. Naturally, I had a vague understanding of the things Kahl was plotting. And the Chaos Prince was common knowledge for everyone who has ventured into more than 10 rifts. Maybe recent rifts are different, but back in those days, rifts were filled with ruins and hieroglyphs that revealed the history of the underworld to us. I suppose you know about the underworld too. Northern remained silent, watching carefully and offering no response. The atmosphere felt frigid, too cold, despite the seemingly accommodating air Ruffsberg wore. Nebulous Lord growled, his sharp, slitted eyes blazing with white light. The rest of them seemed to react as well. Then suddenly, in a blink, Ruffsberg was standing before Northern alone, smiling. As I was saying, you have grown. Despite everything the Dark Continent might have offered to tear you apart, instead you tore it apart and rose above it all. Ruffsberg wore a smile, gazing at Northern like a creator admiring his finest creation with a satisfied grin. Meanwhile, Northern was bewildered. He frowned, unable to grasp what had just happened. Everything appeared exactly as it had been before, but all of his summons were gone, even Byran and Revant. All of them had suddenly vanished, and Ruffsberg regarded him as if he hadn't just done something extraordinary. At least he could sense their presence, so they weren't completely gone or dead. They were simply within his soul. How did he do that? Look at you. The Dark Continent plan worked. Stars, I thought I was mad, that I was going too far. He smiled, gazing at Northern with gentle eyes. But seeing you comforts my soul. I was never wrong. The harshest battles indeed forged the greatest warriors. Look at you. Just look at you. Northern scowled at the man, grimacing with such a dark expression that shadows seemed to coil around his face. He could almost taste the vile bitterness of disgust on his tongue. You are insane. You are mad. You are the most deranged being to ever exist. You set such a towering standard for madness that you make mentally deranged people seem sane. He slowly rose to his feet, Annette and Vita watching him. You took hundreds of students, every year sent them to a continent swarming with monsters, tore them from their families, dumped them in a realm to suffer and die as though they were worthless livestock. You call that strength? You made them suffer. People died. The veins on Northern's forehead bulged. Ruffsberg bore no particular expression. He simply looked down with a dark glare that made him seem like an ascended being judging those beneath him. Then he grinned. You're angry? Good, good. Hold on to it, sharpen it. It means the lesson was seared into your bones. He gestured vaguely. The students. Yes, they did scream. They bled. They died. His grin widened, twisted and vile. Yet look at you. You crawled out. You survived. You conquered. He leaned in slightly, his voice a dark whisper like corrupted gospel. Tell me, Northern, would you undo it? Would you trade the experiences for them? Would you let go of who you've become just to spare them? Northern glared at him as he continued. You call it madness. I call it refinement. You see ashes, I see forged iron. Consider what the legends gave us. Peace that made men fragile. Comfort that stole all will. A generation of soft clay pretending to be stone. I shattered the clay. His gaze grew calm, soft, and what rose from it was you. He nodded gently, his lips turning downward with graceful indifference. I don't blame you. In fact, I expected you would hate me, curse me. That's how I knew it would work. Hatred is honest, it proves I cut deep enough. The world has no place for mercy, young man. I didn't prepare children to live. I prepared them to endure what should have destroyed them. Northern glared at him, horrified by the madness Ruffsburg was almost weaving into sense. You used us like animals. You butchered teenagers. There is no lesson in slaughter. You murdered people. Ruffsburg smiled. Many were killed, indeed. You could call it slaughter, but there's another way to see it. Sacrifice, more accurately. But let's not pretend you didn't benefit. His voice grew distant, as if he were speaking across centuries of war and death. Every great nation was built on corpses. Every hero stepped over the bones of the weak. I merely stripped away the illusion that life was kind. He looked at Northern with a tender expression and placed his hand gently on Northern's shoulder, dismissing the relevance of distance. Do not grieve for them. They are the reason you exist. And in the end, boy, I believe that made their deaths worthwhile. Chapter 1008 True Fear. Northern continued to glare at Ruffsburg with a dark grimace. He wore the night over his face like armor and looked like the incarnation of a grim reaper who wanted nothing but to harvest the soul of vile evil and disaster. Someone who did everything but die. His mind remained sharp, despite being in a severely weakened state from the battle with the Leviathan. Ruffsburg had just exhibited a power that was utterly foreign to Northern. From what he could see, the only explanation Northern could devise was spatial manipulation. It would be brutal if Ruffsburg's talent was spatial. Come to think of it, teleportation. The memory struck him suddenly, and Northern grew even more certain. The letter he had received from Ruffsburg possessed some strange ability that had teleported him. The circle of light he had seen in the hall moments before he was also teleported to the rift, along with the others to the Dark Continent. Indeed, Ruffsburg wielded spatial ability. He was powerful enough to teleport 100 people to a distant land without even being present at either location. Of course, extensive preparation must have preceded such a feat. Northern was certain. However, he still had to ask, how did Ruffsburg know to teleport them back to his soul? A gentle sound reached Northern's ears, pulling him from his thoughts. Someone had risen behind him and was stepping forward. Northern's frown deepened as he watched her. Annette's eye blazed, not the usually visible one, but the one that typically hid beneath her hair. It burned with pure fire, making it seem as though everything inside her body was aflame, and this was the only outlet. Her skin exuded smoke as well. Ruffsburg regarded her with an indifferent expression. His eyes remained cold for several seconds. Then suddenly they widened slightly in recognition. Ah, the child. Kamyun's daughter. The Ishar family of fire. My. Ruffsburg gestured low with his hand. You were barely this tall the last time I saw you. Look at you now. You have even mastered essence fire. He clapped slowly. Of course. I expect nothing less from the strongest vassal clans of the empire. However, then the life in his voice, his eyes, and the air around him withered. What are you doing? Annette froze, dread seeping through her from within. Ruffsburg's eyes fixed on her with indifference, yet she felt utterly exposed and vulnerable before his gaze, as though that damned stare was shredding her clothes and slicing through her flesh. She bit down on her tongue, then her lips bit down until blood began trickling from the corner of her mouth. But it wasn't enough. She couldn't move. Fear paralyzed her completely. She kept biting the inside of her mouth, digging her nails into her palms as she clenched her fists. But the pain couldn't distract her from the terror. She had thought she wanted to land at least one blow for all the people who had died. But Ruffsberg's mere presence, his gaze, made her feel like an ant. He was the vast, endless sky, and she was just that tiny crawling insect. No matter where it went, it remained beneath the sky's watchful eyes. Her burning eyes slowly dimmed, flickering weakly as she lowered her head, sweat dripping from her face to the ground. Northern watched her and scowled. Then he moved. Before Ruffsberg could react, a massive explosion of air erupted behind him, followed by a shockwave that seemed to warp space itself. Ruffsberg's eyes widened in bewilderment. That indifferent, condescending look vanished instantly, replaced by disbelief and shock. The force of the blow escalated, sending him tumbling through the air. The ground detonated, and a massive crater formed as Ruffsberg was hurled away. Even after he vanished mid-flight, reappearing elsewhere, a massive crater continued to be carved by the attack's force, as if the substance it was meant to hurl had simply removed itself from that space. Ruffsberg slowly approached Northern and touched his ribs where the punch had landed. A small bruise marked the area, one that was gradually healing as he examined it. Ruffsberg lifted his gaze from the bruise and fixed his eyes on Northern, still visibly shaken. "You struck me? So fast, so powerful. How did you manage that?" He narrowed his eyes, white light emanating from them as he scrutinized Northern intently. Your soul is different from moments ago. What did you do? How did you absorb another soul?" Northern didn't respond. Instead, he focused on his hands, gripping his wrist with his other hand, frowning. The blow had completely shattered the bone in his wrist, and he felt searing pain in the area. Of course, for someone like him, this level of pain was still manageable. However, something else occupied his mind. "It's different. It feels faster and deeper." It was difficult for him to explain the sensation, even to himself. But what he knew was that the process of changing names had undergone a remarkable transformation. Before, the new names felt like extensions, soulless mimicries. Even now it could still be considered mimicry, but this mimicry wasn't just an extension or reflection of sorts. This time, the mimicry possessed a soul, and because it had a soul, the mimicry could achieve perfection. Northern was still far from perfect, but changing to Titan's Reckoning had been a much swifter, more authentic process than ever before. Northern even felt he could reach for his other talents through DIY, though it would probably require tremendous effort. This was a monumental step toward perfection. "I like my new soul." There were still more aspects to explore, of course. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. He was transformed. Granted, he was still exhausted, physically strained, and his essence was depleted. He had only one clone remaining in Limitless Void. And after Ruffsberg had somehow managed to banish his summons back to Limitless Void, he was being extremely cautious about any interaction with that realm. The last thing he wanted was for Ruffsberg to discover a path to his soul. Chapter 1009. Does the end justify the means? Damn. His wrist throbbed despite his attempts to dismiss the pain. He had unleashed colossal force, yet still shattered his wrist from punching Ruffsberg. "Speaking to you without getting a response is irritating. I'm certain I'm far older than your grandparents." Northern finally lifted his head. "I'm not sure why you're interested in talking to me. I'm after your blood. I want to kill you, and I will kill you. But to satisfy and justify my selfish desire to end you, I also want to interested in talking to you." "Hey, Ruffsberg, does the end justify the means?" Ruffsberg touched his jaw gently, contemplating. If you're talking about this, then it does? I mean, don't you think like me? I believe you agree that the end do justify the means. When you look at yourself and some others, it's comforting. Northern nodded, his expression blank. You're indeed right. Your means justified your end. You know, as much as I want to say you can't sacrifice the lives of 100 people just so one strong man can exist, or that you can't make the decision for people, all this is nonsense if that one strong person is capable of saving billions, or if they'll never make such a decision for themselves because of complacency and lackadaisical attitudes. However, because I exist or some other strong persons exist, doesn't mean you own us or that you're absolved. It also doesn't mean the price was fair. You should bear the weight of your decision. Northern stared at him intently as he added with a tone of finality. Yes, Ruffsburg, your end did justify your means, but it can never erase the blood on your hands, and it will never earn you forgiveness. So, I think I have more than enough logical reasoning to kill you. Northern looked at Ruffsburg and smiled. And it just so happens that I'm not the only one desperate for your blood. A subtle frown appeared on Ruffsburg's face, and at that moment, the entire world darkened, a bit, like storms were gathering in the cloud. Something from a vast distance away streaked forward with black light and black lightning dancing violently around it. The black streak of light was swift and happened in the blink of an eye. Ruffsburg crossed his arms and threw himself backward to evade the brunt of the attack. But even the periphery of the attack was enough to carve a powerful crater into the crater they were already in and cause shockwaves to spiral out upon collision. Ruffsburg wasn't sent flying back like Northern's attack had done, but he also wore a stern expression, which meant the attack troubled him. As the blackness dissolved, someone raised their head from within it, looking at him with a dark grimace and crude black markings running across their face. "Welcome back, Principal. I spotted you from over a mile away and just knew it was you. Did you miss your favorite student?" Ruffsburg's eyes widened slightly as he saw the face of the person who emerged from the blackness. Then he grinned cheerfully. "You too. I'm not disappointed. What about Afcon?" Helena exploded with a groan that caused the swirling darkness around her to surge even further, encircling both of them. The darkness condensed into several black rods, forming around her. The black markings on her face spread, covering her eyes and forehead and creating an intricate pattern that made her carry the air and essence of a savage, moonlight huntress. Helena broke away from Ruffsburg, snatched one spear, and clashed with him again, shouting, "You dare utter his name, after everything you did to us?" Ruffsburg watched her calmly, his facial expression hollow while she raged. He seized her black spear and said with an impassive tone, "He died, didn't he? That's tragic. He had a very fragile and insecure heart. If only he'd worked on that more." He casually snapped the spear. "Who killed him? A monster." His gaze shifted to Northern. "Oh, was it him?" Helena didn't answer him. Instead, she released a thunderous groan, and the gathered dark clouds responded with a mighty thunderclap. Northern looked up at the sky and at Helena. He had never truly witnessed the full extent of her abilities, but he knew she must be incredibly strong. No matter how young Helena appeared to the eye, she was at least 10 years older than he was. It was just that she had such a small stature that made this very hard to believe. She was one of the very few who had been in the Dark Continent for a long time, and she had been a sage the longest among them, recently breaking into an ascendant, no doubt. She was stronger. Her presence was more powerful. Even those black rods, Northern had never seen so many at once. Helena was definitely, by the book and by theory, the strongest person currently on the island who could take on Ruffsburg, because she was the only ascendant currently around on their side. Of course, that was as far as books went. The landscape quaked as the clouds responded to Helena's cry, and a thunderstorm crashed to the ground, obliterating the earth and its vicinity. Everything was quickly shrouded in a fierce and impenetrable storm with Helena and Ruffsburg in the eye of it. Northern could see through it easily, but he doubted anyone else could. The storm wasn't just any kind of storm. It was thick darkness that was raging with thunderclaps that could tear apart anyone who came close. The thunderclaps were her weapons in the storm. She wielded them like arrows, hurling them as quickly as she grasped them, because it was lethal if they lingered longer than her hands could bear. So all she did was guide their path. That revelation informed Northern of the nature of Helena's attacks. It seemed like she could only summon and control the storm. Maybe some of her talent abilities made her able to survive it in certain ways, but it was just as dangerous to her as it was to her enemy. She could not create the storm unlike Frostbeard could create ice. Even though they sounded similar, they weren't. Helena's talent, Wildheart, was S-Class, and Frostheart was SSS class. Well, EX now. Northern peered into the storm once again. It's astounding to realize she was this powerful all along. Chapter 1010 Words are valuable. Northern stepped back as the storm swelled wider and fiercer. He returned to Annette's position. She was already on the ground trembling. In fact, from Northern's perspective, it appeared she was weeping. Vita stood behind her with clenched fists, pressing down on her lips, doing nothing. Northern shifted his gaze to her and lingered for a moment, wondering if he should say anything. The truth was there wasn't really anything for him to say regardless. But he opened his mouth. "You don't have to feel bad." Vita looked at him. Annette stopped trembling momentarily, which was proof enough for Northern that she could hear him. He flexed his arm and closed it. "I received a shattered hand from just managing to hit him once. That damn man, he's strong. So don't feel so disappointed in yourself because you couldn't move." Vita stared at him, clenched harder, and lowered her head. "Easy for you to say. You're strong." Northern chuckled softly. "You're right, I'm strong, but it's not easy for me to say. I want to be doing anything else but saying this. But recently, I've learned how much I run away from sympathizing with the people close to me. I keep undermining the influence of my words in their lives or how much weight my words carry to them." He glanced at Annette and traced his eyes back to Vita. "I know we're not so close, but we survived a hellscape together, and we share a level of camaraderie. If you value my words at all, then hold on to them. Ruffsberg, that bastard, is a luminary. There's no way you would have been able to do anything." The moment Northern mentioned luminary, Vita's eyes widened. Annette's head also shot up, a frown darkening her features. "What?" Northern looked at her, suppressing a smile. Meanwhile, Annette stood fully, trembling slightly. "Did you just say he's a luminary?" Northern nodded. "Yes." He turned back to the battlefield. The storms had grown even darker and more vicious, enveloping everything and slowly expanding outward. He looked at Annette and Vita. "I don't think this battle will end anytime soon. Moreover, I think whatever's happening here is merely a distraction. Kahl must be up to something again, which is why I want both of you to leave the island." Annette stared at him, her brows furrowed. Her empty eye socket looked awkward. This was the first time she was revealing it when it wasn't burning. Northern had expected to see a different kind of eye, but he was quite amazed to see an eyeless socket. Still, the ocular abilities remained nonetheless. Maybe the eyes burned to manifest the abilities. Annette's harsh voice yanked him from his thoughts. "What are you saying? Leave you alone here?" Northern raised a brow, watching her continue. "We're not going to do that. I know you're strong, but still some—" "Stop!" Northern cut her off at that point. For some reason, he experienced a vivid déjà vu. He exhaled. "If you know I'm strong, then just get away. I mean, isn't it obvious that I can't die? Even if Ruffsberg is strong enough to kill me, do you think you or anyone on this island can survive? Or can do anything worthwhile to stop it?" Annette scowled. "What are you insinuating? That we're useless?" "Yes, you're all useless, but not entirely useless. You're all useless in this battle, but instead of being reckless about it, the strength you possess can still be put to use, just not here. How difficult is it to grasp that?" Annette scowled deeply. "As much as I want to argue you're right." She raised her head and marched toward him, flames flickering in her hollow eyes. "But don't think I don't know you could have made that sound better than you just did." Northern grinned. "We probably wouldn't be at this point if I had done that." Annette pulled away from him, still frowning. She sent a glance at the terrible storm beyond Northern and brought her eyes back to him. "What do you need us to do?" Northern sighed, every trace of seriousness climbing his face. "Kahl, he's nowhere to be seen. However, I'm sure he's planted numerous people who are now wreaking havoc. I encountered one in Variolania, but I can't help thinking about the other places. I'm sure drifters will rise up, but still, there's no one who knows the gravity of what's happening like U.S. survivors of the Dark Continent. Annette folded her arms and tilted her head slightly. Forgive me, but I don't think I know the gravity either. Ah, right. Northern paused for a fraction of a second and continued. Remember the thing I stopped from descending in the Dark Continent? That rift. A shadow fell across Annette's face. She glanced back at Vita, whose eyes immediately widened. Then she turned back to Northern. That can't be? Northern nodded. It's a long story, but the bastard I killed came again, and oh dear stars, I'm gonna kill him for real this time. But that's not the priority, neither is Ruffsburg. Right now, the entire Central Plains could collapse if Kahl is allowed to release that origin of chaos. Annette trembled slightly and wiped sweat from her face. Just how did it get to this? 1 minute I was just trying to uncover the shoddiness tied to the Academy's creation and its main purpose. The next minute, the entire fate of the Central Plains hangs in peril. Northern looked at her, slightly confused. What do you mean? It's a long story too, but everything that's happening now. Let's say it's been planned 300 years ago. She paused and glanced toward the storm with a suspicious gleam in her eyes. For all we know, even Milwa might be alive. Northern's expression became quite exasperated. What are you saying? Annette waved her hand dismissively. This isn't the time for explanations. Vita and I will find a way out of this place. Still bothered by what he just heard, Northern pulled out his identity card and handed it to her. Just go to the Therian Citadel. You should find Ellis on the ship, go with him. And with the rest of the survivors, take them back to the nearest place that won't be affected by the scale of this battle. Then head to Therian Citadel. Since this matter somehow concerns them, they should be willing to help. Besides, they can't really turn me down. Annette examined the card and nodded. All right then. She turned to leave. However, in that instant, someone burst from the ground, with a swift movement, lunged her stiletto toward Annette's eyes. Everything happened so fast, yet so slow. But it wasn't the speed itself that left Northern frozen, eyes wide. It was who he saw. Aster. Chapter 10-11. The Feral Ascendant. Helena had so much she was bottling up, so much she was crushing down, so much she could say but chose not to. Of all the students caught up in the Dark Continent incident, she considered herself and Afcon no victims at all. Many weren't given a choice. However, she was, and she chose to do it. Not because she needed to. Not because Ruffsburg preached some strength-aspiring message to her. Simply because he had promised to take care of her family. Of course, Helena was young then. She had applied to the academy hoping to become a student, join a great citadel and lift her mother, brother, and sister from poverty. She was especially confident in her victory because she was the most talented in her town. Everyone was certain she would get in. However, the academy shattered her hopes and dreams. They refused her. Someone with S-class talent was told she was talentless. She couldn't understand at the time. To her, it felt like life was viciously unfair. She hated the people who praised her strength. She hated the old men who taught her battle and forced her to train. She hated the teens her age who were easily defeated because all of them contributed to her inflated expectations and, by extension, her crushing disappointment. However, some time later, an old man approached her and told her he could help her achieve her dream. What was her dream? Helena's natural response had been to get into a great citadel like Riveramore or Calvin, to make substantial money and take care of her parents. And the old man had said, if you could endure 10 years of suffering to take care of your parents, would you do so? Helena didn't even think before she responded, because she would do anything for her parents. Throughout her time in the Dark Continent, she had made peace with her decision. She was sorry for those who weren't given a choice like she was, but there was nothing she could do. She kept this secret, and the only person who truly knew was Afcon. After all, he had a similar situation. However, upon returning to the Central Plains, the family that was supposed to be taken care of was no more. Her mother died of an incurable disease. Her brother joined the army to care for his sister and was assigned to a rift with some major where he lost his life. They said no one else made it out besides the major. And her sister was working as a maid to some rich noble who abused her. She joined Thalen's citadel and rescued her sister, but the girl bore resentment toward Helena for leaving. Her family had enjoyed great riches for a while after she left, but it could never compare to the joy of her presence. Her absence in the family had begun to kill it from within before their mother's death kick-started everything. Helena hated herself and despised Ruffsburg for abandoning his promise. He could have done more than send money, but he left them to die. How could she not repay him the favor? The storm that enveloped both of them was madness incarnate. Wind howled like mourning beasts. Thunder struck in recursive rhythms, each boom overlapping the last, as if the sky itself was panicking. Helena was in the center of it all. Her feet barely touched the crumbling ground. She streaked through the maelstrom like a bolt of black lightning, rods forming midair and hurling at Ruffsburg with raw, primeval force. Each rod twisted through the air like a serpent of divine judgment. The space they crossed warped. Time shuddered, but not because of her. Ruffsburg was weaving space around himself, like a tailor bored of thread and interested only in rending fabric. One rod struck, or should have. Helena's eyes widened mid-flight as the spear hit nothing. The trajectory had been perfect, but Ruffsburg had been elsewhere. These wasn't a fast dodge. It was as though he was never in his initial position to begin with. A moment before impact, space bent around him, folding like paper and repositioning him 3 feet to the left, untouched. He raised his hand lazily and with a casual flick, slashed the very air between them. A line of silver light appeared instantaneously, but Helena twisted just in time. Her body wrenched back violently as the slash grazed her. But to her surprise, her skin was fine, her clothes was too. There was no cut, but she could feel that something attacked her. And she was hurt. She darkened her face with indignation, and as she was about to dash at Ruffsburg, she dropped to the earth, panting all of a sudden. Ruffsburg looked at her with a condescending glare and scoffed. Then he spoke, his voice carried by the stillness at the eye of the storm. Space sever. Cuts what exists, not what's physical. Fascinating, isn't it? Helena didn't answer. She clenched her teeth and put more resolve into her legs and stood up. As she did, she lunged at him. Another rod. Then 3 more. She circled him, each step summoning a new bolt, each breath feeding the storm. Her movements blurred with rage and momentum. Her markings deepened, more like tribal war paint now, etched with intent to kill. She was throwing her all. And it wasn't enough. Each time, Ruffsburg bent space around her weapons. They ricocheted off invisible barriers or looped absurdly back around to strike empty air. Sometimes they reappeared midair, inverted. She narrowly avoided her own attacks more than once. At one point, she struck the ground to conjure a burst of raw darkness that clawed upward like a devil's maw. Ruffsburg responded by folding space into a cone, crushing the darkness into a compressed ball, then snapped, detonating it harmlessly into mist. Helena was already behind him, thrusting a rod at his back. But it met his palm. You're skilled, feral even, but you're not a tactician. He clenched his hand. The rod shattered into splinters of black lightning. I'm a bit disappointed. Did all you learn from that place is strength and never how to put it to proper use? She didn't retreat. She snarled, and from her chest burst a concentrated scream of power. A pulse wave tore the crater further open, erupting into multiple black spears that didn't fly. They dove, like predators from the clouds. Ruffsburg tilted his head. He touched the space between them and time slowed. The rain curved in midair. Thunder paused. The world stuttered. Chapter 1012. Aster's Betrayal. A dark scowl twisted Northern's face, his eyes trembling with disbelief. Aster. It was indeed Aster, just as his eyes witnessed. Annette reacted swiftly, snapping her head back and seizing the hand before it could drive the stiletto into her eyes. She wasted no time and thrust her head forward, smashing into her attacker's skull. However, It was her own head that snapped back, blood streaming from her nose. The boy yanked his hand free and plunged the stiletto downward toward her throat. But Vida had already positioned herself behind him. She tensed her muscles, causing the sculpted contours on her arms to become rigid. Her fist connected with Aster's side. Immediately, a white needle-like light threaded outward in sharp symmetry, followed by rings of shockwaves that rippled like water when a stone drops into it. The shockwave moved faster than thought, exploding through the air before vanishing. Aster didn't fly away, but the ground around them shattered into pieces from the webbed cracks embedded by the shockwave of Vida's attack. The assault was so devastating that Northern froze for a moment. No doubt about it, the young lady had channeled all her frustration from the beginning of the battle until now into that single blow. Aster staggered, blood pouring from his mouth. Even though he had taken such a hit on his bare body, he somehow remained standing. Northern didn't think Aster, the Aster he knew at least, was that resilient. Aster coughed more blood, steadying himself. He grinned as he found his balance, grinning at the girl who stood with a bewildered expression. Ha! Vida was stunned by the minimal damage her punch had inflicted. With the strength she had poured into that attack, she expected his agony to last much longer. Aside from the fact that he had somehow absorbed all the force of the impact, the effect of the pain didn't seem to last longer than 1 second. Vida knew her blows, they hurt. So what was happening? Aster shifted his gaze from her and instead looked at Northern. Annette was clutching her nose, standing and watching with a deep scowl on her face. Aster smiled. Rian, personally, for me, this is an honor. Northern's brows knitted together. What are you doing? Aster slowly tore his dirted uniform from his body. What am I doing? Isn't it obvious? I want to kill your friends. It will be a real hassle if they begin to drive a hole into our plans because of your orders. Beneath Aster's clothes, his body began to transform. His bones seemed to be breaking apart and restructuring, the movement visible beneath his pale skin. His height increased visibly, and his muscles thickened. Northern tilted his head and gritted his teeth in disappointment. Shit, I didn't see that one coming. Long pointed ears, tall pale physique, sharp green eyes, and wet ashen hair that fell roughly around his forehead. Moreover, a silver liquid was flowing over his body, solidifying as it spread. When Aster finished transforming, he held a long, cold, gleaming sword in his hands and stared at Northern with a wicked grin on his face. Did I play the role perfectly? Yep. So well that your sudden personality switch is so difficult to believe. It seemed forced even. Stars, my fate is so bleak. Why are these sorts of hurdles being thrust upon me? Northern exhaled in exasperation. I don't want to have the blood of a friend on my hands. Aster frowned. You seem so sure that you can defeat me. Northern paused, his expression going blank. He blinked a few times, then focused on Aster. Wait, so, you think I can't? Aster clenched his fist tightly around the sword, slowly taking a step closer to Northern. Rian, I have been preparing for this moment since you even entered the picture. Of course, with you entering the picture, things got even better, but I basically lived all my life as a lie so that I could return to my homeland and be united with the rest of my people. Northern threw his head back in exasperation. All right, you must be the one who leaked all my info, my secrets. Which weren't really secrets like that because I mean, what difference does knowing them make? He smiled softly. It looks like you guys have really put a lot into whatever is going on. I feel so bad that it looks like I'm unraveling your plans without even realizing what I'm doing. All I want to do is kill Call and stop Cryo's descent. What has that got to do with your people, Asterman? Aster's eyes radiated a cold, vicious light. The very thing you are doing is what it's got to do with me and my people. Call offers us a way to merge the world back together. He says that Trail and Underworld were two halves of a whole, and that only by bringing the whole back will we have the home and dominion we seek. And you believe him? Aster grimaced. Call has nothing to gain from lying to us. With or without us, this can be achieved. He is merely doing us a favor. Is that what he told you? Aster's grimace darkened further. Wipe that look off your face. He shot forward toward Northern but immediately got intercepted. Aren't you forgetting someone? Vita appeared instantly before him, and her fist crashed down upon his head. Aster quickly raised one hand overhead, but the ground could not contain the force of impact. A shockwave rippled outward, tearing the ground and causing him to lose balance. Vita threw another punch from behind her, but Aster shot his knee forward, and both blows connected instantaneously. Aster's knee to her gut, her punch to his face. His head snapped to the side and she coughed blood and saliva. Both of them staggered away from each other on the crumbling ground. Then they shot back toward each other. Aster hurled the sword at her with ferocious speed, the blade crackling with lightning. By that time, strange armor was already weaving itself around Vita's body. She thrust her fist forward, and the black metal unfolded around her knuckles with dazzling speed. Moments before the sword connected with her fist and bounced off with a spray of sparks. The lightning that had been dancing around the cold blade streaked across her gauntlet and over her entire arm, causing her to recoil slightly. But she clenched her teeth and sent her fist flying forward. Aster's blade and her fist connected, and from both sides, lightning bombarded against each other with a mighty force that roared. Chapter 10:13. The Hunter's Fury. Helena's breath caught. She couldn't move. Her legs obeyed. Her arms obeyed. But everything else in the world resisted. She blinked, and Ruffsberg materialized right before her, hand extended. Before her eyes could register the speed, she was struck. Her body spun violently midair, skidding across dirt and rock, crashing through a monolithic black tree that hadn't been their seconds before. Her vision swam. She wiped blood from her nose, then rose again, trembling. You are a bender. Ruffsberg grinned. Space bender? All right, there are the elementalists, then the benders. A measly classification humanity used to define the kinds of talent that exist. He shrugged with his bare shoulders. Yes, I am. But this is beyond bending space, Helena. If you are going to touch me, you will need to come at me with more resolve than that. Helena glared at him. She growled ferociously and launched herself once more. Black thunder cracked behind her. It formed into a longbow this time, fashioned from condensed storm and grief. She fired a single bolt of lightning, aimed not at him, but at the storm above. It ruptured and darkness fell. And from the sky descended Helena. Multiplied. 12 copies of her fell at once, screaming, twirling with rods, each one infused with blood, hatred, and will. One of them was real. 11 were death feints. Ruffsberg glanced upward, unamused. Spatial collapse. The air around him buckled. All 12 Helenas folded inward, imploded into a point. Then silence fell on the atmosphere. Barely a second later, the wind screamed. Helena reappeared from below, eyes wild, face bloodied, rod in one hand, the other hand casting marks that seemed written in anguish itself. Her body blurred, not because of speed, but because she wasn't entirely present anymore. She had fed herself to the storm. It was almost like a pseudo-transformation of sorts, because since she was not a paragon, she was not truly capable of essence manifestation. But Helena's talent allowed her to manipulate the storm. If the storm was willful, then it was possible to bond with it. If it was not willful, it was possible to control it even better. Her talent ability, Wild Form Awakening, granted her the leeway to merge with Essence of the Wild. The storm was a perfect example of Essence of the Wild. The entire surroundings seemed to be drenched in her presence as she vanished from the naked eye, disappearing into the storm. Even Ruffsberg's eyes narrowed slightly. Helena whispered, "I will feed you to the storm next." With a roar, she unleashed her final attack. Dozens of rods, screaming wind, cracking lightning. Every breath in her body was thrown into war. Each rod collided with his air shields and spatial folds. But this time, she didn't stop. She leapt forward. No evasion, no tactics, just fury. Even as her attacks warped or failed, even as she was stabbed by her own redirected rods, she kept going. Ruffsburg blocked one blow, and for a moment faltered. A sliver of darkness pierced his shoulder. He looked down. Helena was staring up at him, laughing, blood streaming down her cheeks like war paint. Finally, you bled. Ruffsburg's face turned cold. Space bent, and Helena was suddenly flung out of the space and across the battlefield like a ragdoll. She hit a stone, then another, then a cliff. Her bones screamed. Her body refused to move. He stepped through folded space, traversing great distances in a step and appearing beside her. His boot pressed against her throat. You did well, but space is infinite, and you're just wild. Helena choked. Darkness began bleeding from her mouth. Her vision flickered, and then, from afar, lightning split the sky again. Immediately the storm scattered. Northern, who was watching Aster and Vita's fight, paused for a moment and turned around. He watched as something streaked across the distance, hitting and crushing stone before landing on a cliff and crushing it too. None of them in that instance were in the eye of the storm anymore. At that point, he knew it was time to step in. He had missed the battle for the most part, but it wasn't like he was expecting Helena to win. An ascendant against a paragon was impossible, and Ruffsburg was a luminary. If she managed to make him bleed, then it would mean I underestimated her greatly. He turned and then extended his hand outward. At once the sky trembled and a massive whip of lightning streaked into his hand. It was not vanishing. The lightning danced in his hand, peeling away his skin, but the skin was healing itself at a rapid pace. Aster, who had been fighting with lightning sparks dancing around his sword, couldn't help but freeze for a moment. He owned the lightning talent and had trained in it since he was born. He knew everything that lightning could do, but he had never in his life realized that a man, a mortal man, could hold the lightning that connected from the sky to the ground, could hold it right in the middle. Northern looked like he was a star incarnate, wielding nature as a weapon. It made his heart tremble with primal fear, such that he forgot in a moment that he was in battle. Luckily for him, he wasn't the only one that forgot. His opponent had the same reaction. She had been watching Northern for much longer, silently competing against him. One thing that this academy battle had helped her realize with stark clarity was that she was foolish and too ambitious. She did not know what Northern had done to get to this height of power. But they all went to the same continent and he came out like this. She was very sure it wasn't by luck. If it was by luck, then he would have had very rotten luck that only thrust upon him experiences that would break other people. Because that was how he was standing like this, stronger than everyone she had ever laid her eyes on by a terrifying and unrecoverably wide margin. That too as a sage. Chapter 1014. Northern versus Ruffsburg Part 1. The lightning danced frivolously in Northern's hands, looking barely contained. Annette, Vita, and even Aster were all frozen, watching with awe in their eyes. Northern exhaled and then moved. He flashed forward, the lightning almost vanishing, blurring ahead as he blazed across the distance with devastating speed. Ruffsburg was standing above Helena. She was struggling to get up, but the entire space was crushing her back to the ground, and she had not the might to resist the power of space. He turned his head sideways, microseconds before Northern collided into him with the titanic whip of lightning, causing an intense impact that exploded outward and sent both of them reeling across the destroyed land. The forest had been razed to the ground by the Leviathan, and there were several patches of fractured lands. Northern and Ruffsburg flew through all of them, their forces disintegrating the stones and residual trees at an alarming speed. Ruffsburg buried his feet into the ground but was still reeling away, carving the earth as he did. He finally came to a stop and fixed his eyes forward with an even, emotionless look. Northern landed and controlled the whip of lightning. The titanic lightning danced with destruction, spraying around the environment as it lashed through the air and headed for the man standing indifferently. Ruffsburg watched it with still, calm, and unreadable eyes. He moved his hand and tore a section of space, gently like unzipping a coat. The lightning bent midair, curved unnaturally, then vanished into the split. The whip reappeared behind Northern. Northern didn't flinch. He twisted his fingers, coiling the lash midair like a serpent obeying its master. It wrapped around his arm again and crackled against his skin, eager, sentient, biting him with sparks as if asking again. Northern obliged. He lunged. This time he didn't strike with lightning. He struck with fists. He moved like lightning incarnate. Pure momentum, no hesitation. Each step bent the ground. Each punch carved trenches in the air. Ruffsberg blocked with warp zones, distorting the space between them into slabs of compressed vacuum, barriers so dense that matter couldn't survive in them. But Northern's fists didn't rely on matter. One hit cracked a barrier. The next shattered it. The third broke through. Ruffsberg caught the fourth punch with one hand. Their collision created a pressure wave that peeled away the surrounding storm. Thunder fled. Trees splintered. Northern gritted his teeth. Then a wide grin split his face. It would really have been a letdown if it so happens that you were a wimp. The lightning erupted again, this time internal, from within his own skin. His hair lifted, every strand glowing. His eyes blazed with electric white, and suddenly his entire body exploded forward with a flash so blinding. Even Ruffsberg narrowed his eyes. Northern didn't stop. He blurred around Ruffsberg in wide arcs, fists weaving an orbit of force around him. But Ruffsberg didn't counter. He stood at the center, his eyes calm and unmoving. It looked like he didn't even care. When Northern struck again, he reached forward, and the space between them elongated. Northern's punch landed a foot away from where it should have. Space itself had cheated. Ruffsberg rotated his fingers. Collapse. Northern's body crushed inward. Not his bones, his existence. The space around him condensed violently, attempting to trap him like a singularity snapping shut. For a second, his lightning flickered and his body trembled, pinned midair like a statue. But then, a massive shockwave of ice blasted outward, and everything in the atmosphere seized movement, including Ruffsberg. Northern's body began to freeze, and the frost began to break and remake his body, from the minute cell to the tissues to his muscles and his bone. Using absolute zero was to create a vast and endless resource of ice that his body could relate to, and using chaos inherent regeneration, he used the spreading properties of ice to regenerate his body and recreate what needed to be recreated. It was more of what his body could do with its relationship with ice property than using chaos, but he wouldn't deny the fact that it was possible because chaos existed in the first place. He felt a little disappointed that he still had to use chaos in the end, but at the same time, knowing that he was doing so against a luminary made him feel excusable. Northern dropped from the crushing space, his limbs trailing frost, steam curling off his shoulders. The storm Helena summoned had not calmed, but it had stilled. The air had lost temperature so rapidly that thunder itself paused in the skies, confused. Even lightning had begun to move slower, as if it, too, had been snared in an unseen web of ice. Ruffsberg's brows twitched faintly. The earth crackled beneath Northern's feet, frost overtaking the battle-scarred landscape in a matter of seconds. The torn forest froze mid-death. Trees petrified into white statues, craters filled with jagged glacial ridges. Even the wind, the damn wind, came to a halt, caught in suspended motion. Northern's voice echoed faintly, resonating through the frigid stillness like a hymn to inevitability. Let's even the playing field, shall we? The air turned translucent, then solid. Ruffsberg moved, or tried to. His arm lifted half an inch. The motion resisted, not because of power, not because of magic, because the concept of motion itself was being pulled down into a glacial grave. Northern moved, or rather vanished. A streak of white passed Ruffsberg's left, followed by 100 ice spears forming in midair and launching simultaneously. No formation, no warning. They came from everywhere, angles that didn't make sense. From behind, above, even beneath space itself. They weren't just fast. They were faster than fast, born of frozen air, moving through the cracks of halted space, threading their way past physics. Ruffsberg reacted by shifting his body. Took effort. He snapped his fingers, and the space in front of him compressed into a dense cube, swallowing a dozen spears. Another 20 disintegrated upon touching the distorted shell of space he threw around his back. But the rest, they pierced clean through his barriers. Ruffsburg twisted to avoid a fatal hit, and an ice spear scraped his ribs, drawing blood. Another struck his shoulder, burying itself partially before cracking and bursting into splinters of cursed frost. His eyes sharpened. Northern grinned as he saw that he managed to impale Ruffsburg. Thanks to you, I am growing exponentially. Now I have a counter against spatial abilities. Ruffsburg raised his arms, his eyes cold and void. You fool. You forgot the other part. Northern frowned. Something was wrong. Before he could pick it out, though, the lightning danced frivolously in Northern's hands, looking barely contained. Annette, Vita, and even Aster were all frozen, watching with awe in their eyes. Northern exhaled and then moved. Chapter 10:15. Northern versus Ruffsburg, Part 2. Northern shot forward with blurring speed, the lightning in his hands dancing like a maddened whip. His speed was insane. However, Ruffsburg stood above Helena and turned his head. Northern's brows subtly furrowed micro-moments before he collided with Ruffsburg, and a terrible shockwave rippled across the land. Northern was sent reeling back, colliding with his force of lightning and causing it to rip through his arms and back as he rolled away. Blood splashed out in macabre paint as he rolled on the floor before coming to a stop. His body was a mess. His back was ripped open such that his spinal cord was visible. His arms were torn too, blood dampening and soaking them in barely a second. Northern remained on the floor for more than 3 seconds, gritting his teeth in agony. His body was dangerously durable. The only thing that could have pierced and damaged him so brutally had to be his own attack. Northern bit through the pain, and chaos began to mend him. First, the muscle fibers of his back flowed and merged together, eventually covering his spinal cord before skin sealed over it. The Night Terror armor was terribly split, jagged metal shards gaping as if a mighty hand had ripped it apart. Northern slowly stood and examined the armor on his body. Night Terror armor was in a pitiful state yet still managing to hold together. He gently grazed the edges of the metal split with his fingers, feeling a sharp pain in his heart, a terrible and uncontrollable ache of loss. It was difficult to explain, but his heart ached. He and the armor had come from way back. Northern was still staring down when his eyes suddenly narrowed to slits, cold blue light radiating from his irises. I'm going to fill your last memories with his blood. Northern hurled himself through space, his speed increasing. The moment he moved, he vanished into fragments of light and sharply reassembled before a blink. His hand, extended like a blade, shot toward Ruffsburg, completely catching the man off guard. He had no time to block Northern's attack because the whole movement had happened while he was clearly still looking at Northern. However, before the light could transform to information on his retina that Northern had moved, Northern had arrived before him. The space shifted as Northern's hand reached him. The attack resounded somewhere else behind Northern, causing a wide cleave to suddenly appear across the leveled forest to his left. However, Northern was grinning, which left Ruffsburg confused. He wanted to move but suddenly staggered to the side, his eyes widening as he felt something strike him but couldn't quite see it. A fake! Ruffsburg frowned as Northern straightened, looking at him with a raised head and glinting eyes. You bastard! You did something just now, didn't you? I'll figure it out on the second trial, don't worry. Ruffsburg's frown deepened. He knows? No, he doesn't. He felt it. But still, how does that make any sense? Rewind is something that I almost forget myself when I use it on my body. How can he feel it? Oblivious to Ruffsburg's thoughts, Northern paused and watched. Then he moved again. Ruffsburg was standing when the hand came from behind him, this time even faster. The movement didn't register until his hand had fallen. Ruffsburg's head shifted by reflex, and Northern's hand fell on his shoulder. A massive spray of blood gushed out like a fountain and sprayed Northern's face and body, marring the broken and nearly shattered armor. Northern licked the blood on his lips with a cold, dark gaze. I am going to enjoy killing you. Ruffsburg was silent, but his frown was weary, betraying the uncertainty he tried to suppress. However, he held out his hand and folded it into a fist. Immediately, Northern felt a crushing force. Something was compressing him. He tried to move, but that only caused more agony. His legs twisted out of shape as though this space was not meant to be walked by him. His entire body felt as though it were constructed wrong and was breaking through every part of his being with excruciating pain. Northern was a friend of pain. To hurt was painful, and to heal was also painful. However, this pain was like nothing he had ever experienced. He could not move. He could not fall to his knees or even shift his hand. He was standing, and it felt like he was standing with all his bones in the wrong places. If he tried to kneel, it was as though his femur could tear out of his knee. Ruffsberg put his hands behind his back as he walked closer to Northern. "It is stupid of you to think you can kill me, but I guess I can understand. Call was right in every sense to be worried about you. You are a dangerous existence." A grin spread across his face. "One that I have created myself." He chuckled pleasantly. "I have managed to create a masterpiece." Northern was staring at him. His glare shot like daggers that could stab Ruffsberg multiple times until he was lying in his own pool of blood. He then gritted his teeth. His teeth felt inverted, like he was biting his own self, and so trying to grit them was a pain that seemed to ring through his head with madness. But still he was trying to do it. Ruffsberg sighed. "That is a stupid thing to do. You are being rejected by both the space outside and inside your body. Do not try moving. You will kill yourself." Northern was forcing a grin out, and blood was dripping from his mouth. "What's to fear about that?" A cracking sound resounded as Northern began to force movement. All the bones connected to his joints were shoving out of his body. Bones were peeling through his skin. His eyes were stained with blood, and even more blood dripped from his eyes and nose. Standing was painful enough, but moving? Northern felt rejected by the world. Until he moved. Chapter 10:16. Northern vs. Ruffsberg, Part 3. Racked with agony no human should survive. Northern tore himself from the compressive circle. The instant he emerged, he crumpled to the ground, paralyzed. Having shattered his body to escape the law that made space reject his very structure, his entire bone system wasn't truly broken. If he remained in that space, it would feel right, because breaking his bones according to that realm's law was like restoring order. But the defying process was excruciating. Ruffsberg sighed. "How pitiful. I have an endless reservoir of essence. I can simply do this again." The air around Northern compressed once more, and the torment returned. But Northern, he was intimately acquainted with pain. The second time would never mirror the first. He clenched his teeth, blood spraying from his mouth. He thrust his hand with vicious speed, plunging his entire body forward as crimson squeezed from his wounds. Ruffsberg clenched his hands again, but Northern had vanished from sight. He frowned instantly, whipping his head around to search for him, only to sense something elusive. He twisted quickly, but the side of his arm was cleanly severed by a sharp, invisible blade. Ruffsberg's expression twisted as he stared at his arm, blood streaming down his hand, painting it crimson. I can detect every physical object within space. How is he evading my detection? The answer was obvious. Northern's attack wasn't physical. However, that made it treacherous to counter. The attacks that struck his body, those he could handle. The real problem was the one that hit him and left no blood, the one that truly concerned him. That first invisible assault, Ruffsberg was certain his soul had been affected. And he couldn't detect it at all, even after it touched his body. The pain registered in his soul, leaving a trace of the attack itself. But that trace had also vanished from his grasp like smoke. Hence his unease. But Ruffsberg remained confident he could crush the young wildling. He had too many trump cards. And Northern, no matter how vast and powerful he seemed, was merely a sage. A sage against a luminary was madness, unthinkable. Nobody would last 3 seconds against him, let alone escape his space manipulations and make him bleed repeatedly. Considering this, Ruffsberg chuckled softly. I must say you are formidable. A sage, and yet. Ruffsberg glanced at his shoulders, already healed. He sighed. You are truly astounding, but young and foolish. He prowled forward. Boy, why don't we collaborate? I have glimpsed the truth of a luminary and how it paves the path to become a zenith. And perhaps, I may have discovered what lies beyond a zenith. Are you not curious? Are you not curious why we were weakened and imprisoned in this pathetic realm of a world? Fragments of light coalesced to reform Northern. His brows furrowed. What do you mean? Ruffsberg raised his eyebrows, slightly surprised. Don't tell me you were constantly running to avoid detection? Northern tilted his head slightly, still glaring. What about it? Since you can sense everything in space, and my speed surpasses even light, it can move faster than space can remember. Plus, I can easily run at that speed after realizing it. You pose obstacles so trivial for me to overcome. It's why I must implore you to devise something far more challenging. Ruffsberg paused, staring blankly for a moment before erupting in booming laughter that seemed to soar into the atmosphere, spreading echoes far and wide. Northern stared with a disgusted expression. The roar of laughter eventually receded, and Ruffsberg's thick, sharp voice rang out. I'm beyond impressed. I'm speechless. Kahl was utterly baffled by you. Now I see why. And to make things worse, he can't kill you. Ruffsberg suddenly squinted. The power of chaos and void. Why aren't you using it? Northern was still looking with disgust, but this time it was becoming more direct. None of your business. Northern vanished once more. Ruffsberg snapped his fingers, and Northern was standing before him again. It's why I must implore you to devise something far more. Northern stopped mid-sentence. He looked down with a puzzled expression, then looked back up at Ruffsberg. You bastard. Ruffsberg's eyes widened. He really did feel it. Northern apparently wasn't bluffing. He could sense the influence of rewind, could somehow notice himself repeating the same actions. How was that even possible? The concept of time encapsulated everyone and everything. No one should be able to feel its repetition. Ruffsberg's mind churned with 1,000 questions running wild. But in the end, he just sighed and smiled. Northern examined his own hand. What he was saying had suddenly felt like repetition, and it was even more vivid than before. Plus something strange was happening. He was having fragmented memories of what he'd said and done before. This was the major reason why he was taking different routes with his abilities, because he'd felt himself use them and was somehow starting again. It made sense that if Ruffsberg could control space, he also had an ability over time. However, Northern didn't think it would be so overpowered. From what he suspected, it was just something to complement his spatial abilities. In fact, if what he can do is rewind time, then that would explain his body. There was no other explanation, but Northern seemed to fundamentally understand why he was a young boy and almost 2 years later a grown man in his early 30s. Northern opened his hands and immediately, rows of flames spread out into the air. Illusioned Hefter appeared in his grasp, the blade catching the harsh light of the sky. Northern savored the moment, his eyes sharp with focus as he glared at Ruffsberg. Ice spears also began to manifest around him. Then they began to shoot forward. Ruffsberg didn't move an inch. Space either blocked them right in front of him or they were transported elsewhere, so the entire surrounding roared with explosions here and there. Then Northern inhaled powerfully and exhaled, his eyes narrowing to slits. Then he vanished. Chapter 1017. Northern versus Ruffsberg Part 4. Their environment roared in agony as Northern collided with Ruffsberg, or to be precise, the space before Ruffsberg. With his speed reaching unprecedented heights, he moved beyond fast. The first strike nearly caught Ruffsberg off guard, saved only by a luminary's reflexes that surpassed light itself. He snapped away as swiftly as possible, escaping with merely a shallow cut across his neck. Northern had aimed to sever his head completely. In that instant, Ruffsberg coated his entire body with a spatial shield. Northern's blade now met resistance that felt like air itself defying his strikes whenever they fell upon Ruffsberg. Still, their environment absorbed the devastation. The ground convulsed with each falling blade, and the two warriors raced with such lethal velocity that earthquakes rippled through the earth, carving deep grooves as they moved. Ruffsburg had no need to dodge Northern's attacks. His shield protected him perfectly. However, desperation to shatter Northern consumed him. As they blazed across the battlefield with blurring speed, fire and ice spears bombarded him from every direction. He hurled his own assaults, space warped and detonated around Northern, yet none found their mark. With void force brutally nullified by Ruffsburg, Northern's senses sharpened to razor-edge alertness. His spatial awareness operated at unprecedented levels while his brain strained to match the torrential flow of processing, especially since his speed had transcended all previous limits. His mind should have shattered under the crushing velocity his body achieved. Though his form moved faster than light, his processing speed still lagged behind. Thus, Northern's brain worked in overdrive, adapting at a fevered pace. Omniform frantically reconstructed his cognitive architecture to perfectly synchronize with his speed. Consequently, Northern's thought processes accelerated with each movement. The attacks Ruffsburg had effortlessly blocked now became genuinely menacing. Ruffsburg felt the space around him quiver under the crushing weight of each strike. Initially, Northern's movements held no wasted motion, clean, razor-sharp, and devastatingly direct. Pinpoint precision with lethal efficiency. However, they grew increasingly perilous as time elapsed. Their synchronization with the surrounding bombardment became deeply troubling. Northern exploited the flames masterfully. Just as they collided with the spatial barrier, he deliberately hammered down with crushing force, nearly buckling the shield entirely. His manipulation of residual flames proved intensely skillful. Explosions would erupt and flames would spiral upward, forming blazing tornadoes that consumed everything momentarily. In those fleeting moments, Northern would unleash devastating combinations, his blade weaving through air with cold, malevolent purpose. Each arc left pale streaks of light trailing in its wake. His movements became impossible to predict. Ruffsburg couldn't even track them anymore. He could only anticipate and stage preemptive strikes. Even that strategy crumbled. Northern evolved rapidly, even after bringing his sword from the most unconventional angle. With Ruffsburg launching forward with a spatial bomb, Northern's blade was already slicing toward Ruffsburg's throat again, vibrating with such intensity that chills raced across Ruffsburg's skin. Northern accelerated relentlessly, and Ruffsburg found no counter to this escalating menace. His speed posed a monumental challenge already, but became infinitely more dangerous and maddening as it continued surging. At some point, Ruffsburg's frown deepened, questioning, how? The velocity Northern achieved was staggering. It was insane. For someone at his level, a terrifying accomplishment. It almost convinced Ruffsburg that Northern possessed a speed-based talent. However, the ice and fire attacks proved otherwise, so he suspected Northern could replicate talents. Plus, he vaguely recalled the peculiar circumstances surrounding his evaluation. As they clashed like titans in a vast ocean, Ruffsburg smiled. Northern grimaced as he drove another strike downward, but it only streaked through empty air. What amuses you? He seized an ice javelin. It was already upon Ruffsburg's eyes before his sword completed its descent. A massive shockwave erupted outward, followed by white mist from shattered ice that shrouded them both. The battlefield had suffered more scars and wounds than both combatants combined since the battle began. Grooves of countless varieties carved deep into the ground, craters, fractured earth. The leveled forest existed in a pitiful state, looking wretched and stripped bare. Neither warrior seemed to care. It's refreshing to face such combat. Makes me want to unleash everything. Northern frowned. I welcome that notion, because it's only a matter of time before I pierce this shield of yours. Northern dissolved into fragments of light that reassembled while Ruffsburg still watched. He crouched behind and lunged forward with an attack from below, both hands gripping the frigid blade. The blade streaked through air in a blur. Its tip touched the spatial shield, causing white and black sparks to erupt. Space folded like cloth at that moment, light pouring out like blood before the blade streaked away. Ruffsberg staggered forward, turning from Northern, a movement that only began after the blade had already passed. Northern was insanely fast, and Ruffsberg was utterly helpless before his velocity. Now, to make matters worse, Northern was threatening the integrity of his spatial shield. He would slice through space? Ruffsberg frowned as he studied Northern, who remained locked in focus, his gaze inhuman, the light radiating from his eyes chilling. That makes no sense. Northern turned toward him directly, gripping his sword with both hands. His gaze seemed distant, yet he remained present, just entranced. Northern's movements had never been haphazard, especially since he'd been unlearning the chaos art and filling those gaps with something else. First, he was learning to use formlessness as the foundation of his battle art. He wanted to create a floor of vast, endless ocean. This would become his footwork. Upon this foundation, he would build with multiple sword styles. In essence, he was constructing a battle art that could never reach the climax of its prowess. Even as he built upon it, the styles would sink into formlessness, making his foundation and footwork richer and wider. The more he built, the broader his foundations became. It would appear as though he never left the foundation of his battle art, while his foundation would surpass the climax of some paragon's battle arts. Forming the foundation proved rather simple, because formlessness happened to be the very essence of Northern's soul, a concept he had subconsciously mastered. And fortunately, Omniform was growing more active since he'd tasted what it could accomplish. Unlearning chaos art was simultaneously difficult and easy. Most of its essence also explored formlessness, but in a catastrophic manner. It was easy because formlessness existed within it. It was difficult because that formlessness was destructive. Chaos proved a treacherous thing to unlearn. Still, Northern had traveled far in such brief time. Formlessness was becoming the foundation, but for the work to reach completion, he must successfully infuse the sword style he knew best. Cold, misty air seeped from the corners of Northern's lips as he exhaled and murmured. Moonlit Whisper. Chapter 1018. Northern vs. Ruffsberg Part 5. Moonlit Whisper. Single draw path. A streak of light blazed forth, and Ruffsberg was left wide-eyed. The streak of light passed. Clean, elegant, inevitable. It did not burst with noise, nor ripple with arrogance. It whispered through existence, a soft gasp drawn across reality's throat. Ruffsberg's body moved slightly, instinct recoiling without instruction. And yet no blood followed, no sound of impact, no clang of resistance, only silence. But the silence lingered unnaturally, like a vacuum where something essential had been stolen. Northern had sheathed the blade. He didn't need to check the result. Single draw path was never designed to land. It was designed to conclude. The technique opened and closed the sword style itself. A breath of moonlight taken at the beginning, then released only when all else had been spoken in the blade's tongue. And this time, Northern had drawn the path not to kill, but to reveal, to show his foundation. His feet slid gently across the fractured terrain, as though skating across unseen waves. His footwork obeyed the laws of formlessness, neither charging nor retreating, but expanding, drifting, deepening. Silent ripple cut followed naturally. There was no announcement, no posture, no stance. Northern simply stepped, and the space before him collapsed. Ruffsberg's barrier rippled like a stone tossed into a mirror, warping violently as though something had cut through its very intent. Not the shield itself, no, not yet, but the desire to shield. That was what silent ripple cut targeted. It was not a slash in the physical sense. It was a disturbance, a rejection of solidity. The edge of Northern's blade barely moved, but every motion pressed into the fabric of space like a question. What if this barrier wasn't here? And the barrier wavered, because doubt, when expertly invoked, is sharper than steel. Northern drifted again. Ruffsberg clenched his fists, channeling force into the space around him. But something gnawed at the edges of his clarity. He was bleeding focus. He wasn't being overwhelmed. He was being unmade. Northern was no longer clashing with him. He was subtracting him. One cut at a time. Next came the Midnight Mirror. This technique had no form, no structure. Copied. But not like mimicry. Northern had observed Ruffsberg's counter-movements, his instinctive weight shifts, the tension he placed on his left heel during escapes, the subtle rhythm of retraction after launching spatial bombs, and then reflected, distorted inversions of them. As Ruffsberg blinked to dodge the next strike, the spatial ripple he rode became a trap. He taught Northern too well. Midnight Mirror was not about reflecting attacks. It was about reflecting habits. Ruffsberg's entire martial rhythm was turned against him. His muscle memory betrayed him. Every safe retreat became an exposed point. Every reflex punished. Because Midnight Mirror did not show the enemy their reflection. It showed them the flaw within it. Northern's strikes now resembled nothing. They carried no signature. They flowed across his ocean of footwork, rising and falling like waves under moonlight. And as each wave crested, another technique bled forth. The final pillar. Scholar's reversal. The last technique of the moonlit style. Northern had watched Byran display all three over 1,000 times. And he had, with precise devotion, memorized each motion like a poem etched into his muscles. However, he had never been able to achieve that seamless flow that Byran often explained came with using them as one, not as three. But now he understood. He understood perfectly. Northern felt an epiphany, and something strange occurred to him. It was strange, but he wanted to break the very essence of Moonlight Whisper into formlessness. Invert it. He unsheathed its movements not as they were meant to be, but in reverse. Guard before offense. Recovery before strike. Vulnerability before intent. A paradoxical rhythm, impossible to read. And it worked, because Scholar's reversal was no longer a technique. It was a philosophy, one that stated, even knowledge can be undone. Ruffsberg stumbled. His defense frayed with every interaction. His perception struggled to match Northern's accelerating evolution. Northern was no longer a man wielding a sword. He was a convergence of philosophies layered atop a boundless foundation. Single draw path to begin. Silent ripple cut to erode. Midnight Mirror to reflect and pervert. Scholar's reversal to redefine what was known. Together, they formed the skeleton of a sword style still in birth, a technique not yet named. Because naming it would end its growth. And Northern refused to let it peak. He wanted a style that could never be finished. Only built upon. As he moved, his figure shimmered between existence and abstraction. His sword trailing cold light and haunting silence. Even Ruffsberg, battle-hardened, over 100-years-old Ruffsberg, stood frozen for a breath. Then he whispered quietly, "What in the world are you?" Northern did not answer. His eyes dimmed slightly, not from fatigue but introspection. And then, another whisper. Moonlit Whisper. Single draw path. The blade sang again. A subtle, chilling tone that rang in the hollows between worlds. It sliced not through air, not through flesh, but through distance. And distance obeyed Ruffsberg. Or it used to. For the first time in his 100 years, space betrayed him. The cut did not follow a trajectory. It unfolded. Northern's blade had not merely passed through Ruffsberg's shield. That would have required breaking the barrier, a feat even most paragons dared not attempt. Instead, the blade had gently folded around the barrier, whispering into the seams of space like a secret, a bypass, not a confrontation. Reality warped, folded, split. The barrier remained intact, but its meaning was gone. A fissure bloomed between two fixed points of space, one before Ruffsberg's throat, and the other just behind the edge of Northern's blade. And so the sword never traveled. The world moved for it. Ruffsberg felt the cold edge pass across his skin. A light line carved along the side of his throat. His eyes widened, not in fear, in disbelief. A sensation he had not felt in decades. Intense physical pain. But more than that, he felt unsafe. A violation not just of his body, but of his dominion. His authority. His identity. He reflexively triggered 12-layered displacement fields. Space around him fragmented into recursive defense grids, each one capable of folding reality around his body like nesting armor. Planar reflection fields, temporal shear disks, dimensional shunt loops, each one activated near instantly, but none had preempted the attack, because the attack had never entered. It had already been. A single bead of blood rolled down Ruffsberg's throat. He touched it, studying the crimson with an almost curious detachment. Impossible. Chapter 1019. Northern versus Ruffsberg, Part 6. Enlightenment. Ruffsberg's voice didn't sound angry. In fact, it seemed to be the other way around. He sounded almost happy, such that a small smile lingered on his lips. He was being forced to reassess the very mechanics by which he survived. For a man who had mastered space, this was theft. His pride, his laws, his throne, all shattered by a strike that should not exist. Ruffsberg's brows furrowed as he finally raised his head to meet Northern's blank gaze. How? This is will manifestation on the level of a paragon. How did you achieve such a thing at your level? Northern did not respond. He was there, staring at Ruffsberg, but at the same time he wasn't. Congratulations! You have set new standards for yourself. You have begun an endless journey to a peakless height. Chaos art is being destroyed by Omniform. Unwritten is unwriting the depth of chaos in your soul. You have lost item. Chaos art has been destroyed. A new heritage is being written. Footwork. Formless has been gained. You have created a new heritage. Path of the endless. Everything felt quiet. Not in the way silence grips after battle, but in the way truth settles, not needing to be said. Northern stood, unmoving, as the system messages faded. Not just off his interface display, but into the marrow of his existence. Words that were never meant to be read aloud, only understood. He should have felt elation. But what settled in his chest wasn't joy. It was stillness, presence deeper than pride. A sensation like being hollowed out, but filled at the same time. As if some ancient cavern in his soul had opened, one he had never dared to name. And now light poured through it, without beginning, without end. Is this enlightenment? Northern had asked that question with honest wonder. But the answer did not come in words. Came as a knowing. A sharp, cutting understanding that bloomed behind his eyes and rippled through every breath. And he understood. Enlightenment wasn't power. It was perception. Not the act of becoming more, but of seeing clearly. The veil had lifted. The sword had spoken. And the essence of it all was something he had always known. Formlessness is not the absence of form. It is the truth that all form is fleeting. It is not chaos. It is the acceptance of change without resistance. His past self, the one who clung to the chaos art, had sought to master destruction, to wield instability, to dominate entropy itself. But in doing so, he had shackled himself to outcomes. He had become obsessed with the culmination of his art. Victory, defeat, triumph, survival, all endpoints, all forms. But Path of the Endless required no endpoint. It rejected destination entirely. He saw now that every sword style he'd ever learned was just language. But language was only the beginning of thought. Eventually, thought must become silence. And silence must become intent. That was what formlessness truly was, not having no form, but being beyond the need for one. And he had reached that point not by mastery, but by unlearning and letting go of what he thought he was. The moment I stopped trying to climb, I became the mountain. He breathed in, and the breath tasted different, like it no longer belonged to him, yet sustained him all the same. His feet didn't touch the ground, they existed within it. His sword no longer needed to swing. His thoughts no longer needed to react. Each step now carried possibility, not attack, not defense, just opening. He was no longer progressing toward a peak. There was no peak. Only the walk, only the path, and he had chosen the path of the endless. Even now, Ruffsberg, one of the most feared spatial wielders in existence, watched him with an unreadable expression. He was wary, not hostile, rather, aware, because Ruffsberg understood what had just occurred. He knew it all too well. It was the reason he despised drifters who were swordsmen. The fact that at any point, any experience, any realization in battle could propel them into enlightenment, thus magnifying their strength manifold. Of course, he too had experienced it. It was, after all, his gate to becoming a luminary. But he had not accepted it. He had contained it, shaped it into a domain of rules, laws, barriers. This was one of the many reasons that Ruffsberg believed he was very different from many people who were like him, why he was very different from even his own master, Milwa, and also very different from Northern, who had let himself be consumed by enlightenment. Ruffsberg held a completely different and strange worldview when it came to matters like this. He was voracious in nature, especially for good virtues, and his desire for good things knew no bounds. Yet his greatest fear through them all had been being controlled by his greed, being controlled by his desires, being controlled by rules, by laws, and by even his own strength. He loathed being controlled. He despised controlling also. He just preferred the necessity and flow of existence. But he understood that for that to happen, he needed to be immensely strong. And so he had struggled all his life to grasp knowledge beyond reasoning. It was what had caused him to stumble upon spell arts. Of course, spell art had started with Milwa, but since Ruffsberg never accepted Milwa's heritage, he never got it. Instead, he carved his own. Spell arts was how he became a renowned drifter, was how he carved his path of strength. Spell art was what made people mistake him for a drifter with a spatial talent. And it had been mighty to this magnitude because he did not let the Enlightenment shape him. He shaped them instead. And he contained them within himself. He looked at Northern with a slightly raised chin. A slow beat of breath passed. Your growth is going to be your undoing if you keep going like that. Ruffsberg opened his hand, manifesting a large tome that floated before him, its pages flipping open. All right then, boy. Let me show you enlightenment. However, the space around them rippled, causing both of them to raise their heads with a subtle frown. Then something fell right between them and devastated the entire land, casting a shockwave and rolling debris and dust. Chapter 1020. Northern versus Ruffsberg Part 7. Raven's Return. The entire ground shook violently. Northern stood through the force of the shockwave, undeterred. While Ruffsberg was shielded by space itself, the debris and dust separated, fled from him. Slowly the dust began to settle, and Northern could pierce it with his eyes. In fact, the moment the person landed, a dark frown settled on his forehead. At the same time, his heart was leaping, black lustrous hair fluttered in the wind, sinister black armor that seemed to embrace smoky darkness as a cloak, and a pale, expressionless stare with crimson eyes that was utterly unreadable. The most unreadable of them all. And two long, macabre swords in her hands. Northern's eyes were radiating an eerie coldness. Evil and dangerous. Raven. She turned to look at Northern. Then she smiled. Northern felt his heartbeat quicken. He frowned at both the racing heartbeat and the smile. What? Why is she smiling? That evil being. The darkness that served as her cloak solidified, extending into one enormously long black wing towards her right side, before it completely vanished in a spray of feathers. She slowly walked closer to Northern, her sinister and sleek armor perfectly emphasizing her gorgeous curves. She stopped before him and looked up at his face. You've changed. Most certainly, bitch. Northern's voice was calm. So have you. Raven winced slightly, looking at herself. Have I? Northern furrowed his brows. Why are you here? In the Central Plains? I thought you were imprisoned. Raven chuckled lightly. It is a long story, but as for why I am here, I came here for you. Terence is missing. Northern looked at her indifferently, then averted his gaze, shifting toward the direction where Ruffsberg stood. I am sure you are more than capable of finding her, instead of wasting your time finding me. Raven shook her head. You don't understand. He glanced at her with a dark frown as she continued. The only reason why she is missing is because Ul took her. At that moment, Northern's expression changed. What? Not just that, but the entire Central Plains, both here and Stelia, is about to brace for an impact of destruction that would reshape the continent for decades. That was the last vision she saw before Ul took her away. Raven looked down and trembled slightly. Northern's eyes widened a little. He had never seen her so shaken. She lowered her head, trembling more, not saying anything for a while. Then her voice crawled out, shakily. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm helpless. I have no one to rely on. Terrence is gone and I don't even have the right to seek your help. This feels helpless, shameless, and selfish of me. But please, I need to find Terrence. Northern did not know how to feel anymore. The way her voice trembled, and how she was sounding. She was definitely crying. Raven is crying? Almost. He almost felt like pointing his sword to her neck and asking, "Who are you?" The Raven I know will never cry. Yet this sounded and felt very much like the Raven he knew. Of course, her tears didn't mean she received a pardon. But Northern could very much understand one little thing from her despair. She's human, and she cares about her friends. Terrence, at least. So he didn't need to be a bastard to her. At least not now. He exhaled and touched her shoulder gently. We will find Terrence. I can't make any promises, but I do have a thing or two to settle with Ul. Ruffsberg's chuckle entered his ears as he ended his statement. The man was already standing in front of him. Raven raised her head and scowled, while Ruffsberg looked at her with an intrigued smile on his face. I remember you. One of the exceptional students I had high hopes for. The Kageyama girl. You survived too. Her frown darkened, and she glanced at Northern. He nodded. Yup. Ruffsberg. Raven clenched her fists tightly on her swords and, with sudden ferocity, pushed one leg forward, unleashing tides of darkness strikes that whirled and rolled forward with intense fury. Ruffsberg, though, had vanished from the space, standing behind her and gently tapping her shoulder. You are aiming at the wrong place, young Paragon. Northern was not surprised when Ruffsberg said it. He could see it as clearly as he could. Raven had become a paragon, which was incredibly outstanding. What more did he expect from Raven? She was always exceptionally gifted. But from her movement just now, she was miles away from landing a hit on Ruffsberg, which wasn't too difficult for him. He raised a hand, and suddenly Ruffsberg scowled and vanished away from both of them. Raven looked around first, then looked at Northern with a subtle and slightly tense frown. Northern responded indifferently. Don't worry about it. He simply received soul damage and fled. He always runs. That is what he's good at, really. That is why he is so adept at space manipulation. Raven was frozen for a second. She gulped and forced out a pale chuckle. You've become really different. She turned away from him, hiding her reddened cheek as she muttered. And cool. Northern raised a brow. What the fuck? Seeing Raven act girlish suddenly felt so uncool and cringe. Anyway, what do we do? If you need my help, you'd have to wait till I am done with this guy here. Raven's expression hardened. Anything I can do to help? Yeah. Take notes and learn. He disintegrated into fragments of light, leaving Raven frozen with wide eyes. She gently summoned a small leather notebook from her soul and a quill ink pen, then stared forward with intense focus. Raven did not have as much animosity to settle with Ruffsberg as Northern did. She still blamed him for the cruel fate he thrust them into, but she swung her sword not for herself but for the sake of others. Maybe that was why it lacked the resolve of Northern's strikes. After all, she truly began to enjoy life after she got sent to the Dark Continent.